"So, Jason, what will you do now?" Smick Lancher asked in a hushed voice. Jason Todd stood opposite him, draped in a heavy robe that concealed his decaying form. He remained silent at first. Then, slowly, Jason raised his hand and examined it. Though Smick's stab to his heart had paradoxically saved him, it had also condemned him to something far worse, a half-death. His fingers were pale, bruised, lifeless. His chest neither rose nor fell. His heart had stopped, yet somehow he still existed. "This place isn't safe anymore," Smick said, his voice weary. "Negary's forces are hunting us down. It's over, we lost." Jason remained unmoved. Smick hesitated, then added, "You could come with me. If revenge is still what drives you, the Roya's kingdom may have a solution to your condition." But Jason shook his head. "I've survived this long for vengeance. I can endure this body, too." He took a shaky step forward. "There's a place I must go, somewhere I can gain the strength to truly take my revenge." The defeat in their last encounter with Negary had made one thing painfully clear. Jason was still too weak. During the chaos of battle, he had been powerless, useless. That humiliation burned into him. Years ago, he had turned away from the path to power because the risk was too high. Death was almost certain. But now, with nothing left but his vendetta, he was willing to risk everything again. "Give me a Hans Beast," he said. "I need to get there before my body gives out completely." Smick nodded. "No problem." Guilt flickered in his eyes as he glanced at his cutlass. His weapon, the thing that had doomed Jason. A faint golden gleam pulsed along its edge, and for a moment, Smick's mind blanked out. Elsewhere, Llewyn Donner had already reunited with the battered Rivers, bringing with him devastating news. "Meyerson betrayed us. Cardinal Augustine and the others, they're gone. We're all that's left of the church's reinforcements." Rivers' face turned grim. "Where's Grosk?" "I don't know. I was unconscious when I woke up here." Just then, Grosk appeared, breathless. "We don't have much time. Negary's men are using the guise of hunting fugitives to wipe out every remaining force in Reastromia. If we stay, we die. Isabella and her daughter, they're my hideout." The three of them made their way to the hidden shelter. A carriage was already prepared. Isabella and her daughter were waiting inside, ready to leave. Grosk ordered guards to escort them out of Rhea, but stayed behind himself. As the carriage disappeared into the distance, he exhaled a heavy sigh. From the shadows, a figure emerged, Yadley. His face bore the marks of transformation, scales and a smile too wide to be natural. "Well done, Grosk," Yadley said, his voice like a whisper from deep water. "You chose wisely." Yadley's gaze fell to Grosk's chest. "That tentacle embedded in your heart will remain. Don't worry, I won't kill you. Just keep your mouth shut." He turned toward the road, watching the carriage vanish into the horizon. Lord Negary had once guarded Nala closely, but now he let the church take her. Peace would not follow them. Yadley smirked, unseen by even himself. His eyes flashed gold for an instant. In the carriage, Nala's eyes shimmered gold in response. The news of their defeat spread rapidly, almost as if orchestrated in advance. It was a victory for Negary. After that battle, he vanished, leaving his ghost men to cleanse Reastromia of resistance. Those who could be controlled were absorbed. The rest were crushed. The territory, once slipping away, now firmly belonged to Negary, and through him, the Koshi people. Smick returned to the Roya's kingdom alive, but not unscathed. His failure in Rhea cast a long shadow. Even within his own family, whispers spread, questioning his right to succeed as head of the Lancher house. Now he sat alone in his study, his cutlass at his side. To protect his future, his father had arranged a political marriage. The soldier named Smick Lancher would soon be remembered only as a nobleman. But more than politics weighed on him. His body had changed. He'd surpassed human limits. And though that terrifying presence from the past hadn't returned, its absence was almost worse. He looked at his cutlass, unease gnawing at him. Far away, a cloaked figure trudged through a hidden canyon. Jason Todd moved slowly, his body stiff with decay, reeking of death. He had reached the sacred valley, the domain of assassins, fanatics who pursued power for a forgotten belief and the fabled artifact that promised it. Jason had once walked among them. "Why have you returned?" A voice echoed from the canyon walls. He pulled back his hood, revealing a grotesque, rotting face. "For vengeance," he rasped. "I have no other choice." Then, raising his eyes to the dark skies, he whispered, "May life itself watch over me." Back in Intercam, Rivers, no longer a knight, spoke gravely to a young girl now dressed in boy's clothes. "The political situation has changed. No one can know who you are," he said. "You'll pose as a boy from now on. I'll train you. You may not be able to receive a grace, but you still have Chris respiratory art. That's enough to forge you into a warrior." "Understand, Mr. Rivers," Nala nodded, determination burning behind her youthful eyes. "And soon, I'll need to go to Taroe," Rivers added with a sigh. "Why?" He opened a small chest filled with keepsakes, bones, medals, trinkets. "These belong to Mr. Chris. Taroe was his homeland. He has a son your age. I have to return these to him." Not long after, the war between Royas and Intercam began, and across that turbulent land, each survivor, each shadowed warrior, carried with them the scars and seeds of vengeance. The war between the Royas kingdom and the Intercam kingdom was no longer a matter of if, but when. And in time it came, inevitable, devastating. Under King Eldridge's iron-fisted rule, the Royas military had been forged into an unstoppable war machine. Their soldiers were disciplined, their generals ruthless, and their strategies without flaw. The kingdom had long been preparing for conflict. In contrast, the Intercam kingdom was crumbling from within. While the enemy grew stronger, Intercam's noble class remained obsessed with decadence. The Church of Divine Grace was paralyzed by its own inner conflict, torn between devoting resources to spreading faith or strengthening military might. King Seth I clung desperately to his throne, uninterested in reform or resistance. Petty squabbles and personal ambition outmatched duty and unity. It was no wonder they couldn't form a unified front. As Royas' forces swept across the kingdom, one defensive line after another fell. Intercam's borders shrank by the day. Nobles who lost their lands fled to the capital, only to stoke the flames of political infighting. At the heart of this disarray stood the capital, Ingmarlo. On the outskirts, a modest farm had become a training ground. There, clad in armor and wielding a knight's sword, stood Nala. Her golden hair was pulled back into a simple tail, her expression calm, focused, determined. Across from her stood Rivers, equally armored and poised. Once a knight of divine grace, he had been forced to abandon his holy gifts when his body could no longer channel them. Stripped of divine power, he had returned to raw swordsmanship, and it had flourished. His strikes were swift, deliberate, and heavy like they could cleave stone. Yet Nala parried each blow with unshakable poise. Her breathing was rhythmic and precise, her movements fluid. Despite her young age and small frame, her strength was monstrous. Dragon's blood coursed through her veins, awakening more with every passing day. Rivers had no doubt. This girl carried a dragon inside her. She was lighthearted in battle, almost playful. He recalled her voracious appetite during meals and chuckled inwardly. "No wonder she eats so much," he muttered, stepping back and lowering his sword in surrender. "I yield." Between the respiratory art passed down by Chris and the latent power in her bloodline, Nala had already reached the level of a top-tier warrior. Her only limitation was lack of real-world experience. Her instincts, however, were terrifying. In battle or otherwise, she moved with an uncanny awareness. At dinner, Nala behaved with grace and perfect etiquette, at least at first glance. The blur of her hands, as she wielded her utensils like weapons, betrayed her strength. The sheer quantity of food she consumed dwarfed that of everyone else at the table combined. Then, mid-bite, she stopped and turned her gaze outside. Moments later, a figure in white robes approached the house, Llewyn Donner, now known as Cardinal Donner. He had risen swiftly through the church's ranks following the chaos in Rhea. He entered the home with solemn grace, bowing respectfully to Isabella, nodding to Nala, and signaling for Rivers to speak with him in private. Outside, under the fading light, Wen spoke gravely. Turkam is collapsing. We've lost over half our territory in the past 7 years. The city of Calamity is now under siege. If it falls, the path to Ingmarlo will be wide open. Rivers crossed his arms. So what are you really saying? He already knew the answer. King Seth I, desperate to cling to his throne, had secretly dispatched envoys to plead for a ceasefire, offering captured territory as compensation. But all 3 envoys died under mysterious circumstances before they even reached Eldridge. The message was clear. There would be no negotiation. This war will continue whether we want it to or not, Wen said. But if we can't stop them, we'll lose everything. There is still one card left to play, Wen continued. Many nobles who lost their lands escaped with their private armies. The force they command is significant, but leaderless, chaotic. The church is no longer unified enough to guide them. That role must fall to the one foretold in prophecy, the saintress of salvation. He paused, letting the words sink in. It must be Nala. She's still a child, Rivers protested. You know the burden that title carries. There is no other option, Wen said bitterly. We wait for our kingdom to fall, or we trust in her. He sighed. His own rise to cardinal had only been made possible by necessity. The traditions of the church had been set aside in the face of annihilation. Eldridge would not stop with the kingdom. He would erase the church of divine grace itself. Drastic times demanded extraordinary people. Let me think on it, Rivers muttered. Some people, Wen replied quietly, are born extraordinary. As he returned to the house, his eyes met Nala's. She smiled at him, innocent calm. For the briefest second, a golden gleam flickered in her eyes. Meanwhile, in distant Rheostromia, the world had changed. Though stripped of its old prosperity, it had gained something far more potent, stability. Amid a world plunged into war, Rheostromia had become a rare island of order. Inside the Palace of Darkness, Negary sat upon his throne. His face was hidden in shadow, his presence oppressive. Few could remain conscious in his aura. Granny Sealy, his voice rolled like thunder. The prophecy you spoke of, is it truly beginning? The hunched old woman before him cackled, her voice as twisted as her form. Yes, Lord Negary. The saintress will rise. Nala is the key. Only through her can our true goal be achieved. She's still too weak, Negary mused. And Eldridge, even I would struggle to defeat him while he holds that thing. I hope this gamble was worth it. Granny Sealy smiled, her eyes gleaming. You will be the victor, my lord. You are the end. The world cannot resist you. Negary remained silent, but something deep in the shadows stirred.
Hey, welcome to Firescale Audiobooks. If you enjoy our audiobooks, please consider subscribing to the channel. Also, feel free to share your review in the comments section below.
This Granny Sealy, who was by Negary's side, was someone who sought out and joined Rhea of her own accord 6 years ago. She was a witch, the very same kind that everyone thought of from the legends whenever they heard the word witch. From her appearance alone, she fit the role to a T. An eerily old face, a rickety figure as well as weird laughter, the spitting image of an evil witch from any fairy tale. And it was also this Granny Sealy who first prophesied about the saintress of salvation. Soon after she made this prophecy, she disappeared without a trace. The next time she appeared, she came to offer her forehead to Negary on her own. Granny Sealy's current job was to teach Negary her knowledge about mysticism, as well as the legendary Dracatung language. Negary had already managed to extract the inheritance information within the dragon's blood very early on, but as this information was fully written in Dracatung, it was basically useless. Granny Sealy, it wasn't too familiar with Dracatung, but she knew enough to help Negary slowly decipher and derive the inheritance information bit by bit. As Negary stood up from his throne, he displayed a body vastly different from his previous viral body. First of all, it was considerably more muscular. A natural sense of dominance drifted and flowed along his frame, and scales began to manifest on his body. Suddenly, this perfect body began to crack and break as golden blood spilled from inside, flowing all over the floor. The body then immediately melted into a pool of golden blood. Negary's soul stood up from what remained of the body, looked down at the pool of golden liquid, and shook his head. Another failure. I've already reached the peak of this world's strength. That is inevitable. For Lord Negary, this world is much too weak, Granny Sealy sighed as she watched this happen. But there is no need to hurry. Darkness will eventually come, and at that time, this world would no longer be able to stop Lord Negary's path. Negary didn't answer her. Instead, picked up a book from the side and began to flip through it. He wasn't wrong. If considering individual strength alone, he was already standing at the peak of this world and reached a point where he could no longer improve himself. Furthermore, he could sense that he had completely exhausted every last bit of his potential. In the end, he didn't have a true spirit. He managed to use the soul's blood to become a soul virus and once again became stronger. But both this world's environment and the problem of his essence were limits that restrained his growth. The origin is the most essential way for an individual to grow stronger, Granny Sealy explained. Through releasing one's origin step by step, one soul would undergo a qualitative change that allowed them to obtain various supernatural powers. Since Lord Negary does not have a true spirit, you can only seek other methods to improve the quality of your soul. In this world where it would be hard to even release one's origin once, this should already be the extreme limit for Lord Negary to nurture your own soul to this level of quality. Even when this old lady had released her origin once, the power of this old lady's soul was still vastly inferior to Lord Negary. This is what I respect the most about Lord Negary. Granny Sealy spoke with absolute respect. That is not enough. For me, this is still nowhere near enough, Negary replied as he slowly flipped through the book in his hand. What Negary was reading is a history book that he obtained, as well as various travel journals and historical myths. This world had quite an impressive ancient history. Before the Trilantia Empire of the Koshi people, 3 other empires were recorded, which were in order the Lamakt Empire, the Lathe Empire, and the Moy Empire. The name of these 3 empires, in the Koshi language, meant life, glory, and protection, while the name Trilantia of the Koshi people meant hope. All 3 empires passed down various myths and legends with many differences, but there were also similarities. For example, the beginning of this world was always described as being a pure white light. The Koshi people explained that the light killed the progenitor, and the progenitor's body gave birth to all things in this world. Lamakt's explanation, on the other hand, claimed that the light destroyed a corner of God's realm, which rotted and turned into this world. The common thing was that only after that had light came did the world come into being. During the era of the First Empire Lamakt, it was clear that the overall level of power was vastly higher, as the gods truly did walk the earth back then. It was from that era that the respiratory art was passed down and continued even until today. All practitioners of the respiratory art knew of and followed a certain ancient covenant, as apparently the respiratory art itself was related to something extremely important. There's also something strange about this. Clearly, the respiratory art was only a means of perceiving rhythm, yet something made it so that only humans could perform this technique. No matter how well Negary understood respiratory art, as long as he wasn't taking control of a human body, he couldn't perform it. Eldridge seemed to have obtained an artifact from the First Empire that allowed him to create the last god troops. Furthermore, the destruction of the First Empire was also quite unclear. It's a mystery even to this day. Additionally, records suggest that evil spirits did not exist during the era of the First Empire. After a long period of chaos, the Second Empire of Lathe was established. It was also during the era of the Second Empire that the first records of evil spirits appeared. At the same time, the Church of Divine Grace seemed to have been formed from an unknown artifact passed down from the Second Empire. The destruction of the Second Empire appeared to be quite orthodox. At the time, the royal family held absolute power and frequently discriminated against and abused the other races of humans, rousing several rebellions that caused the fall of the Second Empire and rise of the Third Empire. The Third Empire Moi didn't exist for very long. Apparently, not long after they established their rule, they fought a war against an unknown enemy. The majority of the royal family's army and troops were wiped out without a tangible reason, giving the chance for the Koshi people to rise and form the Fourth Empire Trilancia. Unfortunately, Trilancia fell at the hands of a certain rational evil spirit and broke apart. The world situation from then on became how it is today, with the Koshi people scattered all over the continent and the existence of several countries at once. There were also countless smaller countries who established their own rule. There was no longer a single large empire that dominated over the entire continent. The Church of the Divine Grace preached that evil spirits are the sources of calamity. They themselves are errors that shouldn't exist, and that as time passed, when more evil spirits appeared, some kind of great calamity would also approach. There seemed to be some sort of secret hidden within this world, a secret closely related to respiratory art, the Church of Divine Grace, the existence of evil spirits, as well as the world's misfortune characteristic. Through practicing witchcraft, Granny Sealy managed to release her origin, which was also her true spirit, once. She obtained an ability not too different from precognition and came to Negary to tell him of the future she had seen. In the future, the darkness of despair would descend, and that Negary would become the only path of escape from the age of darkness. There was no way to tell the authenticity of these words, but since Granny Sealy had offered her forehead to him, and her expertise in witchcraft as well as Drakatone was considerably valuable, Negary naturally accepted her loyalty. It was also thanks to her help that Negary managed to reach the peak of this world's power so quickly. In consideration of her teaching him many things and how valuable she was, Negary afforded her a bit of respect and addressed her as Granny Sealy. The current Intercam was in total chaos with internal power struggles in every large organization. The war had been ongoing for 7 years straight, but as soon as it began, Intercam had been stuck in an endless cycle of internal strife, leading to defeat after defeat in every single battle. After 7 years of this, the morale of Intercam's army had already reached its absolute bottom. What was even more irritating was that the other small countries had also turned up to declare war on Intercam and sent soldiers to occupy Intercam's territories at their borders. At this point in time, the Roya's army had reached the final defense lines of Calamity. Once Calamity fell, Intercam would essentially become a little girl that had been cornered into a dark alleyway, helpless to defend against anyone. And yet, the entire country had no confidence in being able to defend Calamity. Even though Calamity had the geological advantage, the Roya's army was simply too powerful. Their morale, their equipment, and their supplies all surpassed Intercam by several times. It wasn't that Intercam was poor, but rather all of the country's wealth was concentrated in the pockets of the nobles and merchants, leading to Intercam barely having enough funds to maintain their army. Technically, if Intercam was able to pool its power together, then they still had a fighting chance. But if technicality could directly translate to reality, then there would be no such thing as strife in this world. Tonight, a huge banquet was being hosted by a noble in Marlowe, as it had been for the last few days. In fact, if someone didn't know the situation, they would have thought that Intercam had won the war and a festival was being hosted in celebration. Seth I stood on the balcony of his palace, glancing down at the unnaturally prosperous castle city below. He could only smile bitterly. Aristocrats were selfish creatures. In their eyes, the benefit of their own family outweighed everything else. They understood perfectly well what would happen if this country fell. They also knew that they would only lose more if Royas broke through the final defense lines and attacked. The aristocrats who lost their territories that were taking refuge here were the best proof of that. But if they were asked to provide the funds and people to protect their country without any reimbursement, the only possible answer was no. Aristocrats weren't stupid. On the contrary, as they had received education from a very young age, they were smarter than the majority of peasants. It was not that they couldn't see the terrible state that Intercam was in. They knew better than anyone else what state it was in, but as long as the Roya's kingdom's killing blade still hadn't come down on their necks, they would never regret a single thing. Because they were nobles. Even if the Roya's kingdom completely took over in Turkam, they would still be nobles. To rule over this country, they were necessary, because if the king relied on the foolish peasants instead, that would only cause the country to be plunged into more turmoil. If these aristocrats completely bowed down to Seth I, who represented the crown, which was the royal authority, and contributed manpower as well as wealth outside of their duties, that would mean that the crown would have complete dominance over the aristocrats. This was something that these nobles would never allow to happen no matter what. Nobles had the rights and responsibilities of nobles. After they had fulfilled their responsibilities, if the crown wanted them to give up even more, then the crown would need to give them more benefits. But at this point, the only thing Seth I had was his throne, and it was simply not possible for him to give up the throne. Seth I held major responsibilities for turning the situation into what it is today. All those years ago, it was none other than him who instigated the internal conflict within the royal family to ascend to the Turkam throne. For the sake of this goal, he promised to grant many benefits to the aristocrats and obtain their backings. But the things that he gave away couldn't be taken back. The aristocrats tightly held on to those benefits to the point that they wouldn't let go even if it meant the end for their country, because the benefit of their family outweighed everything else. Seth I couldn't do anything but watch as the nobles numbed themselves with their banquets and parties and pretended not to see the looming threat over their heads. But if one asked Seth if he regretted anything, he would reply that he wouldn't have regretted instigating the coup. Rather, he had only regretted that he was too impatient. If only he had ascended in a more stable manner, he wouldn't have had to give up so many benefits. Your Majesty, the people of the Church of Divine Grace are here. An official nervously approached Seth I and reported to him. Due to the war situation, Seth I's mood had been quite erratic recently. Although he might have seemed helpless in the war, he was still a king in charge of considerable power, and quite a few officials had already vanished without a trace. What are they here for? During the royal family's internal struggle, these people acted impartially towards the chaos and even took advantage of it to prosper considerably. Before the war, they were completely supportive of putting a new king on the throne, but as the war became hopeless, these people instead turned to support him. Seth I knew exactly what the Church of Divine Grace was after. If it wasn't Royas who were invading in Turkam, or if the envoy that the Church sent to Royas over a dozen years ago was successful, then the current Church of Divine Grace would have definitely remained impartial to the war. Truthfully speaking, the people from the Church of Divine Grace could no longer be considered the part of Turkam. They represented a different class of people, the class that held divine authority. If it wasn't for Eldridge's disdain of their god, the Church of Divine Grace would never support him. I heard that it was because of the saintress of salvation. The official hesitated a bit before he replied. He could still remember clearly how Seth went berserk when this prophecy first spread. He sent out his black ops to eliminate a large number of young girls from various royal branch families who fit the description, resulting in him offending many aristocrats. This was also one of the reasons why those aristocrats didn't want to help him right now. The official had thought that Seth I would become furious, but unexpectedly, Seth remained completely calm. In that brief moment, the official almost felt like he saw the young Seth I again. At the time, Seth could definitely be considered a great leader among leaders. Step by step, he pushed the royal family at the time into a dead end and even obtained the support of most great forces in the continent at the time. If not for Eldridge, Seth could definitely be considered one of the greatest rulers in the history of Turkam. Nope. In fact, at the start, Seth and Eldridge were considered equals. Some even considered Seth to be a bit more praiseworthy. After all, Eldridge was already the crown prince of Royas, while Seth was only a small aristocrat from the Turkam royal branch family. But being one step behind resulted in being every step behind. Seth's efforts still couldn't match up to Eldridge's background. The impatient Seth believed that he would be able to gradually unite Turkam under his rule after he ascended the throne, but he failed. Where he stagnated and couldn't move forward any longer, Eldridge did not, and now Eldridge became the one who held the absolute advantage. leaving behind the rival who was once on the same level, or perhaps even slightly ahead of him. "I've already reached the end of my rope," Seth the First commented. Naturally, he could choose to give up on his throne right now. With the power he was in charge of, even without the throne, he could be the leader of a considerable organization. But Seth would rather die than do such a thing, as that was his pride as a king. "Who is the envoy from the church?" Seth the First asked. Llewyn Donner, the official, sighed in relief and replied, "A newly appointed cardinal of the church, as well as the eldest son of the Donner family." "Call him in," Seth helplessly said. At this point, as long as it wasn't the throne, he could agree to compromise on anything. "Your Majesty, I need to be frank with you," Llewyn Donner spoke with a displeased expression on his face, as he held no respect towards Seth the First. "The Intercam Kingdom has reached its most critical moment. Once Ingmarlo falls, the Intercam Kingdom will also cease to exist. This is something that you cannot accept, nor can the Church of Divine Grace." Llewyn spoke without being reserved. "And the only solution now is to pool together all of our power to protect Ingmarlo. Right now, the only one who could achieve such a thing is Nala," Llewyn continued. "Her dragon's blood has already awakened. Together with the prophecy, she holds an unrivaled advantage for gathering support in Intercam. As long as she comes forward, she would obtain the support of those aristocrats who have lost their territories. The Church of Divine Grace will also provide her our full support. Furthermore, the Donner family will also convince the remaining noblemen to provide aid with their private armies." "Then by what name will she come forward with?" Seth the First understood it well. Within the Intercam Kingdom, people had already spread and hailed the existence of a saintress of salvation. When things had gotten bad to this degree, the prophecy of the saintress of salvation became nothing but believable. "The princess," Llewyn Donner replied. "Then so be it." Seth the First didn't try to negotiate anything for himself and made the verdict. The reason why Seth didn't negotiate the position of princess was because he already had no other chips to bet, while the Church of Divine Grace wasn't the same. Although the Church of Divine Grace's influence in Intercam was the largest, they had never stopped spreading their faith to the surrounding smaller countries. For that reason, while the Church of Divine Grace would be greatly hurt from having their roots destroyed with Intercam, they would not fall to ruin completely like Intercam. Seth the First had no other choice. Intercam had only managed to hold out for so long due to the Church's constant aid, so he truly had no other choice but to accept and announce Nala as the princess. With this legitimate identity, if Nala could truly turn the war situation around, then as the one in control of the military, she would then be able to force Seth to abdicate his throne and claim it for herself. Naturally, as the party that contributed the most to this, the Church of Divine Grace would also benefit the most. Of course, the prerequisite to all of this would be that she actually managed to turn the war situation around and repelled the Roya's kingdom's invasion. Otherwise, all these future planning will be meaningless. Furthermore, even if Nala could truly push Roya's back, it wasn't as if Seth had no way to turn everything around. To announce Nala's legitimacy, Seth hosted a grand banquet in his palace. He had a graceful and confident smile, as if the king whose country was about to fall wasn't him. The noblemen also greeted him amiably, as if the ones who refused to provide the men and funds to support the war efforts weren't them. If possible, Seth the First really wanted to kill every single one of these aristocrats, but he couldn't do such a thing. Because if he really did, even without the threat of Roya's, Intercam would fall to ruin, and it would fall even quicker. Aristocrats were an indispensable part of a country, but they were also the cancer. The problem of aristocrats was one that plagued every kingdom without exception. The reason why the Roya's kingdom was so powerful was because Eldridge had conquered over half of the noblemen in his country. The authority and benefits of those noblemen had been reduced to its limit, so much that Roya's had no choice but to declare war. Because if they didn't, a civil war over benefits would break out instead. In a certain sense, Eldridge had also gone down a wrong path. With his talents and abilities, he united the entire country and raised the collective aristocrats of Roya's into a starving wolf. If their conquest of Intercam had been hindered in any way, this wolf would have turned its fang on him instead. Fortunately, Intercam couldn't even mount a reasonable resistance and had already allowed Royas to take over half of their territory. Otherwise, Eldridge would have also suffered heavy losses. In truth, if not for Negary choosing to trust Granny Sela's prophecy and helping Intercam by delaying some of Roya's hidden forces in their country, Intercam's fall would have been a lot more swift. Oh, gentlemen, ladies, I have invited everyone here today to celebrate the return of the Tagula family. With a smile on his face, Seth I gestured to Isabella among the crowd with a glass of red wine and continued. The internal turmoil a number of years ago had caused Duchess Isabella to leave our nation. Now that there are so few members of the royal family left, her return is truly something to celebrate. What? Who else but Seth I had caused the turmoil back then? The scarcity of remaining royal family members is a result of nothing but his fear of others threatening his throne. Moreover, what's wrong with there being few royal family members left? Intercam itself is about to fall. Of course, none of the aristocrats here openly declared such things, because that would be ripping off the thin veil of dignity. Aristocrats had rules for their aristocratic games, and breaking those rules meant that you won out from this particular game. Not only did leaving the game at this point have no benefits, but it would also mean that you wouldn't be able to take advantage of the power of the rules anymore, resulting in your untimely death the following day. The numerous nobles nodded to greet Isabella, to which she responded with the proper noble etiquette. She appeared a little nervous, as she had been living as a peasant woman for over 10 years. In the 7 years after her return to Intercam, this was the first time she had to participate in such an aristocratic banquet. The return of the Tagula family into the royal family records is gratifying. Furthermore, since Nala Tagula has awakened the royal dragon's bloodline, according to the heritage of the royal family, she is now Princess Nala Tagula. Seth smiled. I will send Nala in my place to lead my army to the front line of Calamity and fight for the Intercam kingdom. Seth raised his glass of red wine and was about to point towards Nala when he saw Nala wearing a black dress, standing in front of the buffet table and quickly devouring dish after dish as if she held some sort of irreconcilable vendetta against food. When she heard her name, while her fork was still stabbed into a large slab of meat, she slightly turned her head towards Seth, who was standing in the center of the crowd. In that instant, Seth was a bit doubtful whether or not placing his hope onto this little girl was a good idea. When she saw her mother's tired expression, Nala quickly devoured the slab of meat with her knife and fork, then placed them down in the most graceful aristocratic etiquette she could muster. The awakening of the dragon's bloodline would certainly increase one's appetite. Was the founder of our Intercam kingdom, George I, not also known for his gluttonous appetite? Seth kept up his smile and glossed over Nala's discourteous behavior. Regardless, this banquet had done its job. Nala, who had awakened the dragon's bloodline, was confirmed to be the prophesied saintress of salvation and dragon's daughter. Under the influence of the church, the various forces within Intercam were pulled together and reorganized under the army in her name. Having donned a male standard armor, Nala rode a tall white horse with a knight's helmet. The helmet's visor concealed her immature features while the flag of Intercam fluttered at her back, leading her army to reinforce the front line of Calamity. During their march, some people would occasionally choose to join this army. Quite a few among them were aristocrats whose territories were taken over, but there were also a few young men who had their own personal ideals, such as Baron Rees-Laval. Rees-Laval's father died of illness when he was still a child. Due to his age at the time, he was handed over to his noble uncle to be raised, since his father's title of Baron could only be inherited when he came of age. His uncle was a typical and successful noble. While maintaining a decent facade, he was, in fact, shameless and corrupt. He lived by the aristocratic rules of the game while using various methods to win more benefits for himself. For example, political marriage. The young Rees-Laval was engaged to a noblewoman and was brought to live in her castle. It was a dark period of time for him, after which the noblewoman died in what was said to be an accident. In accordance with their marriage agreement, the noblewoman's fortune was transferred to Rees, or rather, his uncle. And as he grew older and older, the accidents that happened around him became more frequent. In the end, Rhys successfully came of age and inherited the Baron title. From then on, he began to distance himself from his uncle. But the fact that he lived under the shadow of his uncle couldn't be denied, as there were clear problems with him managing his own territory. He had already realized that there was a scheme within all of this. After all, his uncle's men had managed his territory for so long that it wouldn't be strange if he suddenly died in some freak accident. The fact that he was still alive right now could be attributed to the Roy's invasion that drew his uncle's attention. Rhys had a similar personality to his uncle, where they were both experts at taking advantage of the rules. This was a skill he was forced to hone for the sake of his survival, as he had no one he could trust when he was young. He could only rely on the aristocratic inheritance laws to protect himself. He had already gone through the darkest darkness, and thus desired the illuminating light. He had his own ideals, which was why as soon as the news of the Saintress of Salvation came out, he took this chance. Using his name as the lord of his territory, he took all the funds, as well as his private army, to join the march. While he was in the military, all of his uncle's schemes would be rendered useless. If he was able to use this opportunity well, he could even make his name be known widely and earn merits for himself. As he looked up at the Saintress, riding on her white horse, Rhys felt quite a lot of affection for her. After all, for him, the appearance of the Saintress was the same as the appearance of the light he desired. He felt as if he could feel the purity and beauty of the girl as he looked up at her. This girl carries the power to make others believe in her, Rhys sighed and muttered. For him, who grew up without a single person he could trust, to be able to fully place his trust in another person was also a kind of happiness. There's a small village up ahead. We should send some people to check it out and set up camp to rest. Rhys came up and suggested Anala. The situation at Calamity is urgent, but we also need to keep an eye on ourselves. Otherwise, the troops would not have the strength to fight when we arrive. HM. Then let's do as you said, Nala nodded. She didn't really understand marching and commanding an army, but if she didn't understand, she only needed to rely on someone else who did. This man called Rhys seems trustworthy enough. Let's rely on him. Make sure not to bother the people of this place. In a certain house within this village, a man with a plain, unassuming face abruptly opened his eyes with a fanatical look on his face. He frantically opened a drawer and dumped everything out, then ripped open the second compartment hidden under that to take out a book. "The Lord is calling me," he muttered like a lunatic. "The Lord is calling me." He gently lifted the book as if it was the most precious thing in the world, softly caressed it with his fingers before placing it down on the table. The book was only as big as the palm of his hand, with a lifelike golden dragon depicted on the cover. The man then carefully drew a dagger, cut open his palm with a dutiful and ritualistic look on his face before pressing down on the cover of the book. His blood swiftly seeped out, causing the golden dragon to squirm, turning into thin golden tentacle threads that absorbed the red blood before plunging into the man's hand. "Oh yes." Nala abruptly turned and looked straight up at the village ahead. Her intuitions were already sharp, but when combined with her respiratory art, her senses could be considered to have reached the limit of this world. Just now, she sensed an evil and ominous presence flashing into existence within that village before it vanished again. A hand covered in shimmering golden tattoos was now holding the book. The man still had the same plain face without any notable qualities, but he now carried a distinct aura, an extremely dangerous charm and charisma that could rouse both fear and attraction in a person's heart. The only entity in this world with this kind of aura was Negary, and this man was one of the pawns Negary had sent out during the past 7 years. The book was a communication tool that Negary had granted him. The cover of the book was drawn using soul's blood. Ewan he used his own blood to trigger it. He would be able to temporarily become the host for soul's blood, through which Negary could take control of his body and perform what was essentially a divine descent. However, soul's blood wasn't something that just anyone could host. After Negary's descent, the man's body would soon be unable to handle the soul's blood and become literally consumed by it. Not only did all of his pawns perfectly understand this fact, but they were completely willing to do it. Their god would descend using their body, stripped them away from their mortal coils while their souls became one with God. What a glorious thing this was. Negary's eyes seemed to be able to go through the wall and observe the reinforcement army. A group of rabbles in just a few seconds, Negary had already given his verdict. This army was simply a gathering of people from various forces under the lead of their so-called saintress of salvation. While its morale might seem great, the management was chaotic, the staff members were too mixed, the troops clearly lacked uniform combat experience, and various other issues. If this army actually arrived at Calamity, it would die in vain before it achieved anything that resembled reinforcement. Then let's train them first. Negary smirked as he walked towards the other side of the village with the book in his hand. Besides summoning Negary, this book also had another use, which was to carry germs. The entire book was made from a unique material. Each page contained a single type of germ or virus that could be activated via fresh blood. When used together with a certain set of knowledge, this book could create monsters for battle. Negary left the village and walked up the side of a hill to see a number of tombstones on the other side. The dead people of the village would be buried here, and due to the war these past few years, everyone had been living in fear. Combined with the aristocrats' forced conscription and increased taxes, quite a few more people had died compared to before. Mature a bit faster, Nala Negary turned to a certain page that depicted horrendous, ugly monsters. Their bodies were rotten. Their eyes contained no emotions, essentially a group of soulless mobs. There are no traps in the village. I've already picked out a location for the army to set up camp and rest for the night, Reese reported after scouting ahead. Everyone, keep up your guards. Organize personnel for the night watch among yourselves. I have a bad feeling. Nala dismounted, looked around, and spoke solemnly. As night silently fell, a rotten hand broke through the ground, and a shadow had unknowingly draped over this village. During this era, the overall population wasn't that high, so most areas appeared quite sparse. Even though this was called a village, most of the houses were a bit of a distance from one another. This army itself didn't have a lot of people either, but to make sure that they didn't bother the villagers, Nala ordered them not to enter the village, but rather set up camp on an unpopulated area at the south of the village instead. Nala was sitting not too far away from her campfire, still wearing her full suit of heavy armor. Occasionally, she would look up at the other side of the village as she kept feeling an ominous sensation in her mind. Has the night guard shift been arranged? Nala asked Reese, who came to report. It's been done, Reese answered with a troubled expression. He told her frankly without any reserve, but I don't think they're going to spend much or any regard at all to the night watch. The troops' morale is still too low. Reese sat down and sighed. They don't see any hope. They don't believe that we can win, so everything they're doing is without motivation. I understand, Nala nodded. During the past 7 years, Turkham had been scared to death. Any semblance of morale they had before had been thoroughly broken by the consecutive losses. The only reason they were still willing to go on the battlefield in the first place was that they had no other choice. Deserters were treated badly no matter where they went. If a deserter was ever caught, they would be demoted to the lowest rank of slaves, which most people here would rather die rather than become one. Such an army isn't going to do anything on the front lines other than throwing their lives away. Nala turned around to look at the soldiers. She could feel their sense of loss. They weren't afraid of death, but this lack of fear wasn't out of pride or bravery. Rather, they simply had no goals. Sometimes, when looking at these troops, she felt like she was watching a group of walking corpses. Only when a person understood their faith and wasn't hesitant to throw away their lives for the sake of that faith would their lack of thanatophobia become admirable. This state of living as if they were already dead would only cause one to feel sorrowful and sigh. I have to do something to make these people feel alive again. Nala turned back to look at the dancing flames, but her mind was empty. She was only a young village girl. How would she know anything about rousing the morale of her troops? She grew up and spent her childhood in Rheostromia, where most people refused to even acknowledge her most of the time, so she rarely interacted with other people in a meaningful way. When she came to Turkham, in order not to reveal herself to Seth I's hidden forces, she and her mother worked and lived on a farm almost all year round. Rivers had only taught her how to fight because he didn't know how to raise the morale of other people either. Sure enough, commanding soldiers in war is still the most difficult thing to do. Nala puffed up her cheeks as she muttered that. Right now, all she wanted to do was let herself go and enjoy a full meal, but military supplies weren't plentiful, and the weight that had suddenly been placed on her shoulders was causing her to feel dejected as well. Nala didn't understand much about nation and country, but in Turkam was Isabella's home. When she was still young, whenever their lives were tough, Isabella would tell Nala about her stories back when she was still in Turkam. If Turkam fell to ruin, Mama would probably feel very sad. It was with this thought in mind that Nala agreed to Llewellyn's request. Rhys sat on the other side of the campfire and looked at Nala. She was only a 17-year-old girl without any military training. She shouldn't have to shoulder any of this. But when she was the only one who could take up this position, she had indeed come forward. Despite how troubled she clearly was, she didn't have a single thought of running away. What a beautiful soul. Rhys silently had such a thought. I hope she won't be ruined by war. Loud cries and screams of fear broke Nala out from her dejection. The screams are coming from the village. Something must have happened. Nala immediately stood up with a solemn look on her face. Sure enough, that brief, ominous feeling she felt when they arrived at the village wasn't an illusion. Something bad was really happening here. One team come with me to check the situation. The others remain at your stations and wait for orders. Nala loudly ordered and drew her knight's sword. The pure white blade of the sword reflected the dancing flames of the campfire, making it seem like the weapon itself was clad in such flames. At the same time, the armored young girl wielding that flaming sword was also reflected in everyone's eyes and roused an inexplicable feeling in their hearts. Roger! Several people instinctively stood up as Nala ordered. But Nala didn't bother to wait for them. She quickly untied the rope that kept her white horse, jumped on it, and quickly rode the horse towards the village. As he looked at the young girl riding her horse away, Rhys didn't decide to follow, but rather remained at the camp to maintain order. When this abrupt situation broke out, he finally noticed that this army wasn't only low on morale, but its management was also quite chaotic. The private troops that the aristocrats brought all heard his orders, but their first reactions were to protect their lords and completely ignored Rhys' orders. At the same time, every group had their own leaders giving out orders. Furthermore, one of the noblemen immediately panicked as soon as he noticed the commotion and shouted that Calamity had been breached, that the soldiers of Royas had already arrived and wanted to take his men back. This caused the camp situation to go into complete chaos. Oh, it was still fine when Nala was here as they technically had a commander, but when Nala left, none of the noblemen wanted to obey the others' orders. If there really was an ambush, this entire army would be eliminated without fail. Having no other choice, Rhys could only order his own private troops to go help Nala. Then he drew his sword, took out a white glove, and threw it onto the panicking nobleman's face and shouted, "Viscount Majordine, I think you have humiliated the honor of nobles more than enough by this point." Rhys stabbed his sword on the ground right in front of himself and declared with resolve, "If you still insist on backing out, then I challenge you to a duel of honor between nobles. I will cut down your head smeared in tears and snot without hesitation. You will carry your shame with you to the afterlife and face your ancestors of the Majordine family." Rhys then pulled his sword back up and raised his voice. "Now tell me, what is your decision?" Rhys' behavior drew the attention of everyone here. Viscount Majordine glanced at the white glove on the ground but didn't show any signs of picking it up. Taking the chance, Rhys gave his orders. "All troops gather with your own squads and keep your positions. Maintain order and keep up your guard. Wait until the orders are given from the front, then move into the village or retreat in an orderly manner." At the same time, Nala rode her horse into the village while wielding her knight's sword to look for the source of the scream. Dragon's blood granted her the ability to see clearly even in the darkness, so she quickly noticed a man dressed in rags currently lying straight on top of a dead man's body, continuously biting and chewing on something. Apparently having realized Nala's presence, the man turned towards her to reveal a pitch-black, dried-up face with a large chunk of flesh already rotten away, an extremely nauseating appearance. This rhythm, Nala scowled. The man was giving off the rhythm of plants or worms with little to no sensation of a soul. It was a true walking corpse. Nala wielded her knight's sword and cautiously observed the corpse in front of her. Abruptly, the walking corpse charged towards her. She accurately thrusted her knight's sword forward and pierced the heart of the corpse, but it was still moving as normal, trying to claw and scratch at Nala to bring her down. Nala scowled and swung her sword again, cutting the monster's head off. So only by chopping their heads off can they be granted slumber? With that in mind, Nala hurriedly ran towards the victim who had fallen on the ground. The man's neck was already ripped open as his blood continued to flow out without stopping, obviously a hopeless cause. His eyes were looking up at the sky, almost as if to blame something above. Nala put down her knight's sword and took the man's hands, then prayed for him with a wish that he would be able to ascend to heaven above and obtain eternal peace. Soldiers riding their horses quickly arrived behind her with torches in their hands. "Princess, what are your orders?" The soldiers all drew their weapons as they looked down in confusion at the rotten corpse on the ground. The dead seems to be coming back to life. Nala stood up and looked down at the corpse that had lost all signs of life, yet still managed to crawl back up at her feet. She then picked up her sword again. "My God, what is that thing?" The soldiers raised their swords towards the staggering corpse in fright. They had never seen a person whose neck was messed up so badly yet could still remain alive, combined with Nala's words just now. All they felt was fear. "Calm yourselves." Nala swung her sword and chopped off the newly reanimated corpse's head, then turned around to this squad of soldiers. "There's an evil presence that's causing these dead bodies to be resurrected. Those who are bitten to death will also turn into the same monsters. Send 2 people back to report the situation and have them send more people to reinforce us. The rest of us here only have a single job." Nala could still hear frightened screams coming all over the village. "Cut down these monsters' heads and grant them eternal slumber, understood?" "Understood." The soldiers hesitated briefly before loudly responding. After giving out her orders, Nala quickly ran towards the screams. Seeing the princess acting without hesitation, the soldiers also felt a sense of power running through their bodies. The princess was only a 17-year-old girl, yet she could fight without hesitation. So what reason did they have to refuse? Villagers, do not panic. Remain in your homes. If anyone sees a moving dead body, run towards the military camp at the south, Nala loudly shouted. "We are soldiers of the kingdom. We will ensure your safety." A large number of walking corpses turned and charged towards Nala's group. Without a hint of fear in her mind, Nala's sword was without hesitation. She was such a person. Once she had determined something to be the right thing to do, she would do it without hesitation. Just like how she decided to come forward and become the saintress of salvation, as it would please her mother. The ugly corpses fell one by one, as Nala had granted them a silent slumber. Furthermore, as the report was brought back, Reese, who had taken control of the situation, also sent out many soldiers to aid her in cleaning up the walking corpses. After a bit of confusion, the situation finally calmed back down. A few of the villagers who were bitten suddenly went berserk and caused a bit of trouble, but in the end, they were only a bunch of unarmed corpses. Fully armored soldiers with weapons in their hands could easily win against these monsters as soon as they got over the fact that they were fighting dead bodies. "Princess, we've asked the villagers about what happened." Reese walked up to Nala, who stood by the fire with her sword in hand, and spoke with heavy words. All of these corpses were people of the village, but all of them were supposed to have been buried in the village graveyard. "Then bring some people with me to the village graveyard and check the situation there," Nala said. The act of desecrating bodies of the dead was an evil act regardless of the place, and it was hard to say that this wasn't a scheme of Roy's. With how infectious those moving corpses were, if it had been able to spread behind intercam supply lines, then the front line would collapse almost instantly, and there would be no reason for them to go to the front lines anymore. Of course, there was no guarantee that it had to be a scheme of Roy's, because the current Royas could finish their conquest of Intercam even without resorting to these methods. Since this matter couldn't be delayed, the group quickly made their way to the graveyard, only to see empty plots of land behind the tombstones created by the corpses inside, leaving them. Nala used respiratory art to constantly check their surroundings, but she couldn't notice anything abnormal either. Rhys cautiously moved forward while observing his surroundings with his sword in hand. Then, all of a sudden, a walking corpse jumped out from behind a bush and attacked Rhys. Rhys wasn't much of a fighter, but his reflexes weren't slow. This was a result of practice from the various accidents that he had experienced so far. As soon as he noticed the ambush, he jumped back and thrust his knight's sword forward. The walking corpse that charged at him was squarely pierced through the head by his sword. As the corpse's blood splashed everywhere, his face was seen by Rhys. The man had a plain, unassuming face, but carried a satisfied smile even in his death. His right hand that was so dried up it looked almost like a twig was clutching a small book around the size of his palm. Red blood? Did this man die recently? Such a thought flashed through Rhys' mind. As he pulled his sword back, the corpse completely stopped moving and fell to the ground. The book slipped from his hand and fell right in front of Rhys. Nigerian Iriobe. As soon as he saw this book, something in Rhys' mind turned and made it so that he couldn't help himself moving one step forward to conceal it. Nala and the rest who heard the commotion quickly ran to him. As they saw the corpse on the ground, they asked Rhys out of concern, "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Rhys smiled bitterly. Inexplicably, he chose not to reveal the book on the ground, and instead glossed things over with the others before silently picking the book up. Rhys only needed a swift look over the content of the book to realize that it was the reason behind this walking corpse incident. The book had a total of 9 pages, each of which detailed the process of creating a certain monster. For example, the first page showed how to create a monster through a few drugs and surgical modification. Each of these monsters had their own picture depiction that, despite being drawn in simple black lines, all appeared very lifelike, as if they could step out of the book and manifest in real life at any moment. And the 5th page described these walking corpses that they had just fought, but this page didn't have a picture. Rhys carefully stashed this book away with a chilling look in his face. There was a type of monster in this book that would greatly benefit their war efforts, but anyone could tell even without thinking that Nala would never use it to win the war. On the other hand, Rhys desired and craved the light, but he was not someone who would shy away from using a few shady means to achieve his goal. After their search produced no results, the group could only return to camp. Let's say she barely passed Negary was sitting on his throne inside his palace as he watched Nala's first battle and commented on it. Regardless of what happened, Nala's prowess and composure in battle had managed to win the hearts of a few people. And with Rhys' help, this bunch of ragtag reinforcement soldiers was finally looking a bit like an actual army. Nala is on her own from now on. I've given her enough help. Negary squinted his eyes and turned to Granny Sealy. "Granny Sealy, have you seen those people?" "That bunch who came with malice," Negary tested her. "Lord Negary, I've already foreseen those people's goal." Granny Sealy chuckled with her strange husky voice and replied, "They are people from an organization called Hales. Their name means return. They've been acting in secret while avoiding the Church of Divine Grace's heresy hunters. They believe that people should discard their outer layer of ash and return to their original godhood," Granny Sealy explained. "At the dawn of time, the white light cut through a corner of the black abyss of the gods. The corner then fell down where the white light could illuminate the true appearance of gods. What was originally an unfathomable god was revealed by the light and became fathomable. The flames brought by the light burned the power of God and turned into ash that warped and obscured God's original appearance. Thus God fell to become humans. And so, in order to reverse the corruption and undergo apotheosis to return to godhood, one needs to discard the ash, extinguish the flames, and dispel the light, allowing the world to once again return to the black abyss. At that time, they would once again become the unseeable, unspeakable, unfathomable, unreasonable, faceless, and formless God. This doctrine, how interesting!" Negary smirked. "It is indeed. They probably came to Milord in hope of obtaining Lord Negary's power, Granny Sealy, he continued. Regardless of whether or not Hale's doctrine of God is correct or not, some of it can be confirmed to be true. The current order of this world is brought by the light. The light is its skeleton, while the flames are its flesh. In order for them to return to their ideal form of God, light must be dispelled and flames must be extinguished. Since evil spirits are the errors of this world, their very existence are the loopholes within the light and the flames. So the more evil spirits there were, the weaker the light and flames that constituted the world's order would become. Because of this, what Hales does most often is choosing a suitable target, then turning them into an evil spirit through various rituals. Granny Sealy explained. The mist demon of 20 years ago that attacked the Intercam capital was actually created by this organization. They've done thorough research on evil spirits, so they believe that they can control Lord Negary. Thus they came with malicious intent. Granny Sealy once again chuckled with her unsettling tone. But they are mere humans. How could they understand that Lord Negary's power has already far surpassed that of humans and even that of evil spirits? True and pure, invincible, peerless power. However, even though Milord's power is unrivaled, you should still pay attention to the power of the Black Abyss. Granny Sealy abruptly changed her tone. The original appearance of the world, the Black Abyss, huh? Negary's gaze seemed to be able to cut through all deception and obscurity, directly applying immeasurable pressure to those around him. Indeed, ever since the white light cut through the Black Abyss and brought fire to this world, for empires have been born and fell, glory, life, protection, and hope. But the flames that white light brought has already dwindled. The power of the Black Abyss has started to move. That power can surpass the limit of this world. Although not by much, it is still very hard to deal with. Is that so? Negary waved his hand to allow the palace door to open. 3 people wearing fully black masks with a single white tear below their eyes were standing right outside. May the Black Abyss shroud over all. Manifestation of the dazzled. We welcome the manifestation of the dazzled. Let us return to our origin. All 3 individuals immediately began to walk towards Negary with black smog surrounding them. How audacious, Negary commented. You ignore the will of others and force your own beliefs on them to erode them away. How fitting that I am the same. The ground below them suddenly turned into black sludge. Countless tentacles rose from the sludge, trying to catch the Hales members. But while they were cloaked in the black smog, their figures seemed to be illusory as they walked directly through the bindings of the tentacles and kept moving towards Negary on his throne. A withering above an epsilon. God is unseeable. Thus what you see is a shallow manifestation. While clad in this black smog, all attacks would not be able to reach their true self. This was one of the abilities that Hales relied on the most. Each official member would be able to perform a ritual to obtain this black smog that originated from the Black Abyss. All evil spirits are inherently weak against the members of Hales, because evil spirits are the errors of this world. They're the loopholes within the light and the flames where luminance cannot reach, and where the power of the Black Abyss would reach its peak, which means that we would also become terrifyingly strong. The 3 individuals leapt into the air. The black smog that drifted around them turned into countless chains that tried to bind Negary. What a bunch of clowns. Negary remained on his throne as an intense pressure accompanied by an ear-piercing roar erupted from his body. The air itself around him seemed to be breaking apart. Everything else became insignificant, and the only thing that seemed to exist in this world was Negary. The 3 individuals' lifeless bodies fell down from the air. The black smog that surrounded them before scattered to reveal their naked bodies. Hales believed that clothing is born from the light and the flames. Thus using them would further warp and taint their original appearance. Their skins were filled with countless runic patterns and wounds, from which one could tell that these people had undergone untold amount of torture, including being whipped, stabbed, stripped of their nails and skin, castration, and so on and so forth. The flesh is nothing but unclean ash born from the flames. Since they rejected anything born from the light and flames, they destroyed their bodies through pain and torture. believing that they would shed some of the ash by doing so, Granny Sealy explained. Some even say that their ultimate fate would be to shed their own bodies and obtain a new body created by the black smog. Then, what is this the dazzle they spoke about? The ground moved and completely swallowed the 3 individuals' bodies. Unsurprisingly, they didn't produce any soul essence. The organization called Hales had obviously come into contact with even more evil spirits than the Church of Divine Grace, so they naturally had measures against the common abilities of evil spirits. Because of this, Negary could only rely on Granny Sealy to know more about them. After Granny Sealy released her origin once, she obtained the power of precognition and learnt countless secrets of many organizations and of this world in general, becoming a truly erudite person. Hales believed that God is unseeable, unspeakable, unfathomable, and unreasonable. Because of this, those who gazed upon God could only see the 4 states, or rather the 4 sides of God. The dazzled represented the unseeable, the cut tongue represented the unspeakable, the chopped hand represented the unfathomable, and the decapitated represented the unreasonable. Lord Negary's germs are invisible and boundless. Because of that, they believe that you are the dazzled, Granny Sealy explained. It was because the cut tongue had returned to their position that Hales had the courage to show themselves again. The 4 sides of God. How meaningless. Negary stood up from his throne. However, since they've reached their hands out to me, I should repay the favor. Negary's figure slowly vanished. I will leave this to you, Granny Sealy. Yes, Lord Negary, Kiki. In Turkham, Scoro Viscounty, the young Lady Ellis was standing by the window of a tall tower in the castle, looking down below at the knights who were performing their daily training with a bored expression. Originally, she would have stayed at the prosperous capital city, going to organize salons with other aristocratic ladies and chat with the various well-mannered bards about the philosophy of life and their poems, but the war ruined it all. When the Scoro Viscount family returned to their territory, Ellis had no choice but to follow. She was forced to part with the hustle and bustle of the city to return to the Scoro Viscounty that she considered to be the countryside. There was nothing here but daily training, knights preparing to fight, and a bunch of peasants who worked in the fields day in, day out. Without any form of entertainment, she felt like she was going to go crazy. Ellis suddenly noticed something happening at the other side of the training grounds. A young teenage boy seemed to be peeking into where the knights were training and was found out. After being caught, the knights tied the boy's hands together with a thick rope, pulled him up on a tree, and began to lash him with a horsewhip. Emmy, that boy is too pitiful. Go down and save him. Make him a bit more presentable and bring him to me, Ellis ordered as a smirk rose on the corner of her mouth. Milady, the master had said that. The maid Emmy carefully tried to persuade her otherwise. Swiftly, go. Ellis cut off Emmy's words and forced the order. Otherwise, I'm going to grant you a few lashes of the whip as well. A few moments later, the boy who was whipped was brought up to Ellis' quarters. As she looked at the shy and cute young teenage boy dressed in mourning clothes that didn't fit him, as well as the red whip marks on his body, Ellis closed the window, then ordered Emmy to close the door before turning to the boy. Come here, let me see your wounds. The teenage boy was clearly nervous and didn't dare to come forward, but Ellis wasn't angry. She carefully approached the boy who was on guard, lightly combed the boy's hair with her fingers before softly stroking the red whip marks on the boy's face. Her fingers weren't too forceful, but they were enough to cause him to feel a sense of numb ticklishness, causing the boy to squirm in a bit of discomfort. Does it hurt? Ellis asked with a gentle voice. Because she had used perfume, it felt as if her soft voice itself carried a gentle fragrance that caused the boy to gulp and swallow his own saliva. And Beta, the aristocratic young lady giggled, lightly touching the boy's wounds as her lips lightly perked up and slowly approached the young boy. Her well-maintained face was right in front of his eyes. The warmth and fragrance that got so close stimulated the boy's mind. But almost immediately after that, Ellis readily squeezed her hands together with her fingers into the boy's wounds. As she heard the boy's pain screams, Ellis covered her mouth and grinned. How is it? Mongrel, you really thought I was about to kiss you just now, didn't you? Are you feeling pain now? Ellis excitedly grabbed her leather whip and started to whip the boy while joyfully shouting, "Rejoice, for mongrels like yourself. Bringing me joy is the greatest honor you will ever obtain." Back in the city, one of the favorite pastimes of the aristocratic ladies, including herself, was to host salons, bringing in some beggars, homeless people, and peasant children into the venue, then torture these curs to entertain themselves. As she looked at the helpless boy being unable to resist her whip, Ellis gradually became increasingly excited and continued to whip him harder, forcing the boy into a corner of the room. Even the etiquette that she normally maintained had been completely discarded without a trace. Or perhaps, due to the need of maintaining aristocratic etiquette while interacting with other nobles in high society, most nobles were constantly wearing a mask that they could never take off, thus forcing them to remain in a restrained state. And as soon as their restraints were taken off, they would become extremely insane and turn into a different person entirely. No one would be able to tell that the mad woman who was whipping a bloody, poor boy into a corner of the room was the same as the soft-spoken and meek young Lady Ellis. Ellis dropped her whip and violently squeezed the young boy's throat. When she found that the boy was almost unable to breathe anymore, she let go and kicked the boy straight in his stomach, then grinded her soul in. While young Lady Ellis was busy unleashing her madness, within her quarters, two members of Hales wearing jet-black masks with a single tear under the eye were discussing among one another. "Can the target be confirmed?" One of the Hales members muttered in a low voice. Although Turkham is currently stuck in internal strife, and the Church of Divine Grace is busy dealing with it, that bunch of mad dogs won't care that much about a ruined country. If the target is correct, we would be fine, but if she isn't and we draw those mad dogs to us, don't worry, I confirmed it many times. The target has a very high chance of becoming an error. Under the power of the ritual, they will surely turn into an evil spirit and contribute to the descent of the Black Abyss, the other Hales member confirmed. If that's the case, prepare the ritual. We will turn this entire Scoro Viscounty into our sacrificial lambs. One of the Hales men walked through the door of the room. On the other side, the maid Emmy was trembling as she heard the screams of the boy. She was fearful that one day, such a fate would befall her. However, a dagger that abruptly pierced through her chest completely removed this concern of hers. The Hales man pulled his dagger out and swiftly dealt with the maid Emmy's corpse without hesitation. Her innards were spread out in an uneven pattern. Then a white rock carved full of runes was inserted into the maid's stomach. This way, the girl's life essence and soul essence would be retained by the rock and become a part of the ritual. This would greatly increase the chances of an evil spirit being created. It could even ensure that an evil spirit would naturally have considerable strength as soon as it was born. The Hales member didn't stop there. After he dealt with the corpse, he continued going through the castle and killing every person he met, regardless of their age, gender, or status. There was no discrimination under the ceremonial dagger of Hales. Meanwhile, Ellis continued to torture the young boy, completely unaware that everyone else in the castle other than her was already dead. The other Hales member didn't do anything and just stood watch as Ellis' tormenting became more and more intense. At some point, a layer of black smog had slowly engulfed the entire castle and plunged it into an eerie atmosphere. But the excited Ellis didn't notice any of this. When the young boy in the corner was at death's door and would lose his life at any moment, the Hales member in the room finally drew a ceremonial dagger and thrust it straight into Ellis' head without hesitation. The tortured young boy's eyes suddenly became emotionless as his youthful appearance shed away to reveal another Hales member with the same black mask and another ceremonial dagger that stabbed into Ellis' heart. As the ceremonial dagger was pulled out, her blood began to flow and Ellis fell to the ground. Having been pierced through in both her head and her heart at almost the same time by daggers, the young aristocratic lady with a strange hobby lost her life. Before her death, the brief moment of pain was mixed with her ongoing high. Some inexplicable things began to gather above her body and absorbed the white life essence that overflowed from her body. Right in front of the Hales members, the remnant soul that belonged to Ellis was forming. The two Hales members exchanged glances, and took out a gray stone. Unlike the other stones they used, this one was full of tiny holes. The two cut open the corpse's chest, removed all the useless internal organs, and put the gray stone inside. A force capable of acting on souls was absorbing the remnant soul that was forming. These gray stones were the Black Abyss stones obtained by Hales through their rituals over the years. It had the effect of preserving a person's soul and vitality, a considerably precious resource. If they only wanted to form a normal evil spirit, Hales would only need to use at most a single Black Abyss stone to greatly promote its creation. But Hales didn't spend years searching for Ellis just to turn her into a normal evil spirit. They did so because her soul had the potential to become the chopped hand. To this end, they used a considerable amount of Black Abyss stones and even boldly performed the ritual in Intercam, the home turf of those mad dogs of the Church of Divine Grace's heresy hunters. The castle was now full of corpses. Each one of them had a Black Abyss stone buried inside their body. Some kind of force seemed to be acting near these corpses and made the blood flowing out of them form an eerie pattern. The porous Black Abyss stone inside Ellis' body continually vibrated. The life essence and soul essence stored in the Black Abyss stones inside the other bodies were slowly turning into a plume of mist and poured into the porous Black Abyss stone. Eventually, these life essence and soul essence would be integrated into the remnant soul of Ellis, aiding her in becoming a qualified evil spirit. It would then perform a fire removal ritual for her and turn her into the chopped hand that represented God's unfathomable side. In addition to the cut tongue who had already returned to their position, and the dazzled who they already found a candidate for, only the unreasonable side of God, the decapitated, was left. Once the four sides of God were gathered, then the Black Abyss arrival in this world would not be far away. Returning to the Black Abyss was the long-cherished wish of every member of Hales. They all used to be ordinary people, but in this world, being ordinary itself was a mistake. This world should not be like this. Why were nobles naturally born greater than they are? Why do they get to enjoy endless resources, money, food, rights, and women? Everyone is human. So why did some get to have everything they wanted, while they could only endure their tragic fate and suffer all kinds of torments just to helplessly die in the end? Why was it like this? Did they make some sort of unforgivable sin that God punished them so for? Or was their fate like this from the start? Why? Why was there such a big gap between people? And the answer that these people arrived at in the end was that the world itself was wrong. And since the world was wrong, someone must correct it. These people who had made up their minds to change this wrong world then stumbled across some information about the Black Abyss. They studied it closely and finally discovered the truth of this world. The white light flashed through the Black Abyss and brought about flames. The ashes left by the flames had changed their original form. Ranob. It was then that Hales was established. The meaning of the word Hales was to return. Ever since their founding, they had lived and worked for the sake of this great and lofty ideal. Discard the ashes, extinguish the flames, dispel the light, and return the world to its original form. Clothing was born from the flames, money was born from the flames, food was born from the flames, authority was born from the flames, desire was born from the flames, and most things in the world were born from the flames. And so, as one returns to the Black Abyss, everything would be removed. Nobility, money, food, power, and women would all be removed. Everyone would return to the Black Abyss and to their original forms. At that time, everyone would be no different from each other. What a great ideal this was. So why is it that people still could not understand it? They must be longing for the color of the light and the warmth of the flames. They must have been obscured of their original forms by the false ashes and deceived by the useless glamour. But it doesn't matter. Anyone who prevents the return of the Black Abyss must surely be an enemy enslaved by the flames. So we'll just remove them. The ritual inside the castle was still continuing. Everyone here would become a sacrifice and would allow the evil spirit Ellis to continue to grow. In just a bit more time, the chopped hand would also return to them. The three Hales members stood outside the castle and watched the ominous castle with an expression full of piety. They then turned and left the castle. The more sacrifices there were, the better it would be. A newborn evil spirit needed a lot of food. The peasants of the fief were slaughtered in cold blood while they cried for mercy. Their pain and the fact that they too used to suffer like this were completely ignored. The three men with black masks, shrouded in dark smog, did not halt their slaughter in the slightest. All of you are also poor and oppressed by the nobility, so you can surely understand our approach. Since you can understand our approach, please die for our ideals, no, for all injustices in this world. Excuse me, oh my, excuse me, kiki. An unpleasant voice and laughter suddenly resounded. An ugly old lady who walked using a wooden crutch showed up before the three murderous lunatic members of Hales. Standing next to the old lady were three people. A 4 or 5 meters tall fat man, a man sitting on the shoulder of the fat man with a spear on his shoulder, and a young man standing on the side with a shit-eating grin in a white robe. They were the ghost men under Negary. It's like this. Not too long ago, your people sent our Lord a gift. So, as our Lord ordered, we are here to repay the favor. Granny Sealy, he said very politely. Why? Why are there always those trying to stop our noble ideals? Die, slaves of the flames. The members of Hales didn't care what the other side had to say. To them, as long as the other party was trying to prevent the return of the Black Abyss, they were enemies. I think you have misunderstood something. Kiki. Granny Seal gave an unpleasant laugh as she turned a blind eye to the Hales members' attacks. Heavily striking the crutches in her hand on the ground, Granny Seal loudly declared, "We came here with the will of my lord, Negary. So no matter who you are and what noble ideals or evil plans you might have, you shall be dominated by the will of Lord Negary." The battle abruptly broke out, just like that. Standing on Connor's shoulder, Cadi's Mareg began to emit an aqua-blue aura from his body. As he jumped from Connor's shoulder, he drew the long spear from behind his back and thrust it directly towards one of the Hales members. A useless attack. Our original form cannot be seen, and what is imperceivable cannot be attacked. The Hales member laughed as he completely ignored Cadi's spear and thrust the ceremonial blade in his hand towards Cadi's. Cadi's spear directly went through Black One's body, but his body was like a phantom. While surrounded by the black mist of the Black Abyss, his form was imperceivable and thus could not be truly harmed. At the same time, Black One's ceremonial blade directly pierced through Cadi's armor and stabbed into his body. "It's over. There is poison on our ceremonial blade to remove the ash. Time to become our sacrifice," Black One indifferently declared. All lives that try to prevent the return of the Black Abyss should atone for their sins and death. "What nonsense are you spouting?" Cadi's grinned and swept his spear across. Black One's body was sent flying with blood spraying from his wounds. As he looked down at Black One, who staggered standing up, Cadi's threw the ceremonial blade aside, completely unfazed by the bit of black liquid flowing from his wound. He was displaying an excited expression. When you attack, there's a short period where you enter a vulnerable state. Your body is already dead. Black One also noticed Cadi's current state. "This fight is going to be very interesting," Cadi said with a smile. "You're usually in a state where you can't be attacked, while my body basically can't die. Both of us have no choice but to look for the hidden weaknesses of the other party in order to win. But I've already discovered one of your weaknesses. Whenever you try to attack other people, I can attack you. Although there's a lot more resistance than normal, I still manage to do it. So what are you going to do now?" Cadi's asked in a wicked manner. "That thing breeding in the castle is very important to you, isn't it? If you try to run away, I'm going to destroy it." Black One patted the dust off his body. The eyes under the black mask were extremely cold. He could accept his own death, but he could not accept the return of the Black Abyss being prevented. On another side, the tall fat man, Connor Kenway, released the weapon on his back onto the ground. It was a thick iron chain attached to a huge sphere. He wasn't slow, but he wasn't nimble either, so he simply chose to remain stationary. Black 2 charged forward, but because of Connor's large size, his attacks weren't doing much besides tickling him, unable to cause any noticeable harm to Connor at all. And whenever Black 2 tried to turn around to help his companions, Then Connor would move towards the castle. This behavior made Black 2 understand that he couldn't deal with Connor, and that he couldn't leave either, otherwise he would only cause the evil spirit ritual to fail. The huge ball and chain hit Black 2 directly, but as he was surrounded by the black smog of the Black Abyss, all of Connor's attacks simply went through the body, dealing no damage. Connor no longer tried to attack, but if one had special vision, then they would notice a purple aura starting to gather around his body. The last member of Hales, Black 3, was the most unlucky one as he faced Jack the Killer, who had a kind smile practically plastered onto his face. Jack's posture was very flexible, so all of Black 3's attacks were being responded by either being blocked or evaded. "What should I call you, brother?" Jack was holding a dagger upside down as he blocked Black 3's ceremonial blade, while a white mist drifted around his body. Not getting a response from Black 3, he didn't mind and continued to speak. "Seeing how honest you look, I'll call you Little Noodly." Jack's words made Black 3's movements stiffen briefly. Then his subsequent attacks became more and more violent. "Oh, I'm sorry if I hit a sore spot. Really sorry about that. Please forgive me, because I'm going to do it again," and in even more places, Jack once again rolled away from the Black 3's attack and continued to taunt him. "And with circumflexion, if we get a chance, I'll introduce you to a friend of mine. His name is Nil Gigi," Jack evaded again, and said with a smile. "I'm sure the two of you will have a lot to talk about. By the way, can I ask you about something?" Jack's dagger moved and slashed towards Black 3's crotch, but it simply went through without hitting anything. "There's a thing called living while saving the crotch, so why didn't you do that instead and join Hales? Even your little Woody has become a little noodly now." "Asshole die." Black 3's attacks became even fiercer. Jack's cheap words were constantly stimulating him and stirring up his emotions. "So you are angry, just as I thought." Jack's dagger danced around and blocked all of Black 3's attacks. Then his voice suddenly became serious. "The so-called Hales is just a group of defeated dogs after all. After failing until you had nothing left, you could only direct your so-called resentment towards the world itself. You obviously desire the light and fire, but because you couldn't obtain your hope and warmth, you wanted everyone else to lose them as well. What do you know?" Black 3 attacked Jack in a frenzy. The black smog on his body began to swirl and shrink, then gathered on to the dagger in his hand, revealing Black 3's scarred body. It almost couldn't be called a human body anymore. Huge patches of his skin were torn off, several ribs were removed from his chest, with iron nails littered throughout his body. As he held the ceremonial blade coated in black smog, there was nothing but desperation in his tone. "Do you really think my scars were made after joining Hales? Do you really think I don't want to obtain hope and warmth?" Black 3 rushed towards Jack. Since his body was no longer surrounded by the smog of the Black Abyss, he was no longer immune to attacks. "But the only people who could bring me hope and warmth are no longer there. How tragic." Jack's smile quickly faded. The originally white mist around his body had turned blood red at some unknown point. The ceremonial blade and Jack's dagger clashed. The ceremonial blade, clad in black smog, directly cut through Jack's dagger, then through Jack's neck. Jack maintained his grip on the broken dagger, slashed forward with his momentum, and completely missed Black 3's head. If the dagger hadn't been broken, this attack would have cleanly cut through the upper half of his face. But Black 3's body started falling backwards in an upright manner. His gaze under the mask gradually became unfocused. Some auditory hallucinations even resounded in his ears. "Father, I'm going to the inner city to beg. I won't come back at noon today." A little boy between 7 and 8 years old? I haven't seen him. I advise you not to look for him anymore. A few people would go missing just like this every year. None of them is ever found. But if you really want to find him, go to the garbage dump of the Noble area. If you're lucky, you may be able to find the body. Those mongrels really can't take a beating at all. They all die too easily. Guards, catch this mongrel. He dared to try and assassinate me. Don't sentence him to death. I want him to regret his actions. That little cur should be honored to be killed by me. Now that your wretched root is gone, you're not even going to be able to make any more little curs. Jack's decapitated head suddenly grew black tentacles and reconnected to his fallen body. After putting his head back on, Jack moved his neck back and forth a bit, then walked up to Black 3's body. He was either triggered by Jack's words to the point of losing his mind, or he simply didn't want to live anymore. Jack took out a fire starter from his pocket, poured some highly concentrated alcohol on the body, ignited a flame, and lit the body on fire. Although you couldn't feel the warmth while you were still alive, at least your body can feel the heat in your death. Jack shook his head helplessly. What use is there in hating the world? If you wanted something to hate, hate the era. Jack threw his half-broken dagger away. The reason why he managed to kill Black 3 despite his dagger not cutting through him was actually because of the ability of his secondary soul. The Ghostmen soldiers were undead who had been implanted with a secondary soul. And these secondary souls were all created from modifying remnant souls. When a remnant soul was separated from its true spirit, it underwent a process that was similar to an inferior version of the origin, as first stage being released. For example, Negary awakened his ability to control and live symbiotically with germs at the beginning. Due to it being a pseudo-release, the awakened ability would be very weak initially. Negary's bacterial control only grew gradually stronger as his soul form continued to grow, at the same time being extremely difficult to improve qualitatively. From a fundamental comparison, it couldn't be compared with Granny Cle, who had released her origin properly. Naturally, Negary had continued to mutate and developed his germs to create other abilities, thus infinitely improving his initial ability to what it was today. This was the reason why Granny Cle revered Negary so much. The secondary soul that Jack was implanted with had awakened an ability that Jack named animosity manipulation. Unlike Negary's ability, the animosity he could control wasn't what he generated himself, but rather the animosity of others. When Jack used this ability, as long as others hold animosity or killing intent toward Jack, the killing intent would be collected by his ability, then used to form weapons as he wished. Jack's broken dagger didn't even come into contact with Black 3, but the blade of killing intent that grew from it did, which caused serious injury to his mind and even killed him shortly after. It could be said that the more killing intent or animosity other people held towards Jack, the stronger he would be, and there was no one better than Jack at drawing other people's animosity. As the flames flickered, Jack didn't leave to help the others, nor did he go to the castle to stop the ritual from reaching its completion. Instead, he sat down by the fire lit by the corpse and put his hands out to keep himself warm. An undead might gain a practically immortal body, but they would also lose a lot of things at the same time. Since there was a barrier between the soul and the body, his sense of smell was nearly non-existent, so he didn't notice how unpleasant the smell of the burning corpse was. Damn it, where is this fatty's weakness? Black 2 continued to press his attacks on Connor Kenway, and left all sorts of wounds on the big fatty's body, but all of these wounds would heal in the blink of an eye. The body of an undead body had no vitals. Since their bodies were composed of germs, as long as the germ tissues that made up their bodies weren't destroyed in large quantities, they could easily be healed. Don't be anxious. Take your time. Al was killed because he was in too much of a hurry. Black 2 thought to himself. Although he didn't know why the other guy didn't try to stop the completion of the evil spirit ritual, once the ritual was completed, the newborn evil spirit Ellis would be extremely powerful, and evil spirits bred by the Black Abyss stones would naturally be driven by the power of the Black Abyss. They could definitely kill these people without trouble. Enough is enough. Connor, who had been silent all this time, suddenly declared. Black 2, who had circled behind him to continue his attack, abruptly collapsed. Countless wounds appeared all over his body with his blood splattering everywhere, his life gradually slipping away from him. The ability Connor Kenway obtained from his secondary soul was called damage reflection. Each time anyone dealt damage to him, a proportional amount of damage would also accumulate on the attacker's body. This reflected damage wasn't much if triggered separately, relatively speaking. For example, if someone stabbed Connor, the reflected damage would only cause a small scratch. But when the damage was allowed to accumulate and burst out all at once, it was considerably frightening. especially with Connor's undead body. There was almost no way to deal with this ability. It was circumflex. Aha! All of your companions are dead, and soon it'll be your turn. Cadiz brandished his spear as Black One breathed heavily while facing him. Black One had a feeling that this spear user in front of him had the ability to kill him right away, but he was dragging the battle out. There weren't any schemes or tricks involved in dragging this out. The man simply wanted to see him in pain and despair. This man was, without a doubt, an outright villain. He took joy in seeing others suffer, in bringing people pain and despair, in torturing them. He didn't commit heinous acts for wealth or fame. He was simply enjoying the fun of doing them, just like how he chose to become a pirate to plunder from other people. It wasn't that he was too poor that he had to resort to it. On the contrary, he originally lived quite a rich life. He simply chose to board the pirate ship to become a pirate. He was an outright wicked person, but he was both blessed and fortunate. He had chosen to submit himself to Negary and gain the power of a ghostman. Scream! Show me your pain. Cadiz moved back to avoid Black One's attack. His spear swiftly thrust forward and took advantage of Black One's attack, missing to stab his body, then fall to complete despair. Cadiz twisted his spear and pulled it backwards, pulling Black One's blood out together with his intestines. Although the black smog surrounding him quickly made it so that he didn't take any more damage, Black One wouldn't be able to live for much longer. He crouched down on the ground, with an expression full of madness under his black mask. Clutching his ceremonial blade tightly, he suddenly laughed. You were too arrogant. The evil spirit ritual has been completed. Even if Ellis hasn't become the chopped hand, her current self is more than enough to kill all of you. She will devour your souls, and the Black Abyss would ultimately return. In the castle behind him, the large number of dead bodies had all turned into dry corpses. The Black Abyss stones inside their bodies were now also full of cracks, and seemed like they would crumble to dust at the slightest touch. Meanwhile, inside Ellis's body, the Black Abyss stone full of holes was periodically overflowing with essence. The newborn evil spirit named Ellis howled as she emerged from the castle window, revealing her gigantic soul form in front of everyone. The ghostmen themselves were undead, so they could naturally see the soul form, while Granny Sealee, who has been standing in the distance without taking any action so far, was a witch who had released the first stage of her origin, so seeing the spirit form was a basic skill to her. Ella's soul form was very large. Due to the evil spirit ritual, this soul form didn't maintain a humanoid appearance. Her current appearance was like a huge mask that depicted a smiling woman with several dozen soul bands that extended like tentacles floating around it. This was the unfathomable Ellis. The huge mask-like evil spirit of Ellis incarnation floated in the sky. With a flutter of the soul feelers that floated around the mask, their surroundings seemed to have been smeared with a layer of material called falsehood. Under this layer of falsehood, the world felt like it had become beautiful. The sky turned exceptionally clear. Even the stench of fresh blood that was mixed in with the air had turned sweet. Because of the evil spirit ritual, large amounts of soul essence and life essence have been infused directly into Ella's body and raised this evil spirit's soul form to a certain limit. Combined with the power of the Black Abyss brought by the Black Abyss stones, this evil spirit could be said to be one of the strongest monsters in this current world. This was the reason why Hales was willing to use so many Black Abyss stones for this ritual. Through each prayer ceremony, the most they were able to obtain at a time was a small piece of Black Abyss stone. Despite their long years of existence, they only had so many Black Abyss stones, and over a third of their entire reserve was used all at once during this ritual in order to create such a powerful evil spirit. Once Ellis was transformed into the real chopped hand, her strength would increase again. Aha! The evil spirit ritual has succeeded. Black One knelt on the ground with a mad grin on his face. The unfathomable Ellis. Her soul form was surrounded by the black smog of the Black Abyss similar to the Hales members, so her current appearance was nothing but an illusion. Her actual form was hidden behind a mask, and any attacks on her right now would only be like attacking an illusionary mirage. This falsehood could even be derived and spread into her surroundings while also being extremely addictive. The huge mask in the sky constantly wore a smile on its visage, deceiving those around to feel like they were embracing their lover or being held by their mother's embrace. Even Black One, whose intestines had been pulled out, stood up again. The falseness had mended his wounds and even gave him the sensation of his body returning to its perfect state. The soul feelers around the huge, floating mask were constantly fluttering about, but they didn't attack Cadiz and others. Instead, they gently stroked them and returned the vivid sensations to their undead body. Smell, taste, touch, sight, and hearing were all restored to how they were when they were alive. Stop here. You don't have to fight anymore. You don't have to endure more suffering. Live in this beautiful and carefree city, forever Ellis' soul feelers caressed everyone and caused such a thought to form in their minds. Black One naturally knelt down. The hiding survivors of the fief were also lured out by beautiful temptation, knelt under Ellis, and accepted the gentle touch of the soul feelers. Behind Ellis, the door of the castle was opened to reveal the dead knights who were resurrected and a grand banquet which was being held, with food that would never run out, a fountain filled with red wine, and where nobles could dance with their servants as if class and status no longer existed. Black One and those peasants of the fief also joined the party that seemed to never end, enjoyed the juicy grilled steak with white bread while drinking sweet red wine, and chatted happily with the beautiful aristocratic ladies. This was the unfathomable Ellis created by Hales. Her true face was hidden under the beautiful falsehood away from everyone's sight, while the beautiful falsehood carried a fatal sense of attraction to all living beings. Once they were attracted, they would gradually be assimilated further and further into this falsehood and eventually become a member of it. They would join the so-called city of no worries and become a member of this never-ending banquet. The more people who were assimilated, the stronger the falsehood would become, and the harder it would be to escape the assimilation of falsehood. At this point, every living creature except the four on Negary's side had joined this party, including the animals, to form a harmonious and beautiful scene. Join us, join us, join us. A soft whispering voice resounded within their ears. This voice seemed to be able to awaken the greatest desires within their hearts. Immediately after that, a blue flame suddenly burst from the bodies of several people within the banquet. The flame quickly spread and burned the things and people within the banquet. The ability that Cadiz obtained from his secondary soul, Flames of Malice. Each time he attacked, he would mark the body of his opponent with his own malice. When there were enough marks, he could trigger them and ignite the flames of malice. The intensity of the flames depended entirely on how much malice he imposed upon his victim. How unfortunate, but what I want is for the whole world to burn with imperishable flames, and for destruction, disaster, pain, despair to exist at every corner. Your scenery of beauty is exactly what I hate the most. Cadiz declared with a grin, as he was such an utterly despicable scum. The huge mask remained floating in the sky, but the smile on the mask was gone. The false illusion was also gradually fading away. What was originally a harmonious and beautiful scene returned to how it originally was. The delicious food turned into rotten meat and bark covered with insects. The red wine turned into a yellow-brown liquid with unknown things floating inside, and the partying people who originally had no differentiation in class had completely changed. On OS, gorgeously dressed nobles were riding on peasants while ripping and tearing away at their flesh with their wide-open, sharp jaws. Meanwhile, Black One, who had his intestines ripped out, had long since died. Both his remnant soul and corpse fell under the complete control of Ellis as another character within the falsehood. The mild sunlight had turned into a dense, dark fog. The fragrant, sweet air turned into a rotten stench. The smiling mask in the sky was revealed to be a gigantic head, and the soft soul feelers turned out to be its dried, withered hair. As some strands of its hair fluttered down while being burned by the flames of malice, the skull charged straight towards the four people below. This attack was without falsehood, as Cadiz's spear was pushed back when he tried to parry it. A huge pit was formed in the ground under the head's impact. Her power had exceeded the range of what could be handled by humans. Just as humans couldn't fight against natural disasters, they were also helpless against this entity. Because of how huge Connor's body was, he was struck head-on and had over half his body turned into mush. Cotties and Jack managed to evade thanks to their speed, while Granny Sealy was nowhere near the point of impact in the first place. Kiki, how unfriendly. The time for chatting is over. It is time to deliver my lord's true repayment of the favor to you. Granny Seal, I wasn't worried at all that the evil spirit would harm her in any way. Although her combat strength was effectively non-existent, her ability to protect herself was immeasurably strong. If she really wanted to escape, there wasn't a single soul who could kill her. As Granny Sealy opened a golden box that contained a rippling golden liquid, an extremely ominous presence instantly filled the entire area. An entity with a fatal sense of charm had descended upon them. The golden blood simply floated in the air. Negary's soul form that was scattered in other places had descended upon this location through the connection of the soul's blood. How amazing! Negary's soul observed the huge head evil spirit and praised it. Hale's techniques still have some merit to them. To be able to create an evil spirit of this level within such a short period of time, an organization could not exist for such a long time without proper reason after all. As far as the current world was concerned, there was a limit to individual power. According to Granny Sealy, in the ancient times, when the white light came through and brought the flames into existence, the original witches who had obtained their magic power from the flames should have been able to reach the third stage release of their origin. But now, as far as Granny Sealy could tell with her power, she was the only witch who had released the first stage of her origin. Even after taking all supernatural forces in this world into account, there were just barely over 20 people who had the strength equivalent to releasing the first stage of their origin. And some of them hadn't even released their origin in the truest sense of the concept. For example, Chris obtained supernatural power through his respiratory art, but he did not actually release his origin. In summary, although the release of origin was the most fundamental way to obtain supernatural power, there wasn't a strict requirement that one had to do so to obtain supernatural power, especially in the early stage. Practitioners of respiratory art were prime examples of this. However, as Negary had learnt through the information of the world traveler from years ago, most supernatural powers would eventually converge at releasing their origin, the true spirit, in order to improve. Currently, the people of this world could be divided into 4 echelons depending on their strength. Those at the 4th echelon were individuals without supernatural power. The gap between those of this echelon was quite large, such as trained mercenaries and farmers who could only do farm work. The 3rd echelon consisted of individuals with power derived from other sources, such as the transformed undead, or even the crowmen were considered to be at this level. Although they had obtained supernatural power, they couldn't continue to grow stronger through effort. The 2nd echelon was equivalent to those who had released the first stage of their origin. Some of them had released their origin through various means, while others used a different source of power like the respiratory art to obtain supernatural and continue to grow stronger. This new evil spirit, Ellis, was one of them, and so were the ghost men. The 1st echelon consisted of entities at Negary's level. At this point, 3.5 of such entities are known, one of which was naturally Negary, a remnant soul who underwent pseudo-release through death, then sublimed through the soul's blood and raised the quality of his soul form to be equal to a soul who had reached the peak of the first stage of release. The second one was Eldridge, His Majesty the King of the Roya's Kingdom. Through the legacy of the First Empire, this monarch obtained power that surpassed others at the first stage of release. The third was the unspeakable side of God, the cut tongue of Hales who had recently returned to their position. As for the remaining half, even she didn't know that she had this much power yet. Only after she had truly awakened would she be able to fully grasp this power. Naturally, this power ladder wasn't absolute. For example, even ordinary people in the 4th echelon, if well trained and took advantage of their environment well enough, would also be able to defeat those in the second echelon. It was even easier for those in the third echelon to do the same thing. In fact, the difference between them and those of the second echelon wasn't too great. The main difference was that they were unable to grow stronger and develop their abilities through their own efforts. This differentiation mainly existed to see the difference in strength on paper. In a real battle, the victor was determined through their battle sense and how their powers counteracted one another. The gap between those in the same echelon could also be quite large. For example, the huge evil spirit Ellis created through Black Abyss stones could easily crush the Ghostmen who were put into the same echelon. This was also the reason why Negary had praised Hale's techniques. As long as Ellis could complete herself, she might even be able to become an entity in the first echelon, and this level of strength was created in less than a day. Of course, part of this was also due to their arduous efforts spent in looking for a suitable target and a huge amount of resources they had paid. Ella's huge skull uttered a loud scream as the interference force afforded to her by her huge mass surged forward. Connor's half-broken body was once again struck directly and sent flying, unknown if he was dead or alive. The others could also only retreat to avoid this power. But none of this interfered with Negary. A similarly heavy interference force flowed out of Negary's soul and resisted Ellis's interference force. The golden blood continued to multiply in the air until a nearly perfect body was finally generated. Negary's soul then entered the body and opened his eyes. Oh! While the body remained humanoid with a face similar to Negary's soul, the body's skin was covered in golden dragon scales. A raised spur was present at the center of his back with a pair of slightly curved dragon horns on his head. His shoulder blades appeared to be a bit agitated, but ultimately calmed down when a ganglion-like tail grew at the end of his spine. Stability is still a little bit lacking. Negary opened his palm. It was undeniably clear that while in his soul form, his means were too simple and needed a physical body to provide assistance. At this point, Negary had a lot of options for his body, such as the commonly used multi-layer viral body, or the Black Crow body created by the Black Crow germs, as well as various other bodies created by other germs, including humanoid and non-humanoid appearances. And right now, Negary was using his unfinished dragon body, in which the dragon factor within the soul's blood was activated to take this dragonoid appearance. Naturally, this body was still very unstable, as a lot of dragon characteristics couldn't manifest at all, and it would collapse quite rapidly. But it's enough Negary's body began to exude a kind of pressure, the pressure of the dragon. This pressure acted on the surroundings to create some sort of special power, as if the world itself was welcoming the dragon. Seemingly stimulated by Negary's appearance, Ellis sent numerous of her dried yellow hair to try and coil around Negary's body, at the same time releasing an even more terrifying interference force. With a wave of his hand, Negary easily severed all the hairs as interference force pushed back against Ellis. But obviously, Negary's interference force was stronger, and it directly tore Ellis' protective interference force apart. Negary then jumped up and appeared directly above Ellis' huge soul form. Juliest. Negary uttered a strange syllable. This ancient syllable was not a sound that the human body could make. Some sort of power seemed to have been triggered, as immediately after uttering this syllable, his body began to crack and golden blood spilled from all over his body. The blood looked dull, seemingly lifeless. The syllable and the surrounding pressure mixed together to create a miraculous change in the world itself around them. As this power manifested, it caused Ellis' body to break apart until only a tiny piece remained, which was caught in Negary's hand. Ellis wasn't weak, but she simply didn't have experience fighting with supernatural abilities. After all, she was originally just a noble girl with a quirky hobby. Even though she had absorbed the memories of many experienced knights and warriors, they too were only normal people with no contact with the supernatural. Negary was greatly superior to Ellis in both overall control of power and the grasp of timing in battle. Furthermore, Negary was indeed stronger than Ellis, so once he seized the opportunity, Ellis was swiftly defeated. Most of her soul form had already been destroyed, leaving only a small part behind. It seems there will be another Ghostman. Soon looking down at Ellis in his hand, Negary handed her over to Granny Sealee before his body completely broke. The Ghostman troops hadn't been expanded on a large scale over the past few years for a few reasons. Firstly, not everyone was suitable for being implanted with a secondary soul. Secondly, Negary had been conducting another research on remnant souls in recent years, so resources were more inclined to that research. The Ghostmen were also fine as they were currently, so there hadn't been any expansion. At the present, there were a total of 9 official Ghostmen who were implanted secondary souls. Aside from 2 or 3 of them remaining in Rhea to maintain order, most of the others have been sent to perform various tasks, which usually involve traveling to various places to obtain documents regarding the ancient era or infiltrating other organizations to obtain intelligence. Nala has arrived at Calamity and officially joined in their counterattack. I need you to help her in secret. Negary ordered the 3 Ghostmen, and then turned to Granny Sealee. Granny Sealee, bring Ellis back to Rhea. Understood, my lord, everyone responded. Negary's dragon body gradually collapsed and turned into a pool of blood without any glow while Negary had left this place. Originally, it could have supported the form for a bit longer, but after he used Dracatung, the inherently unstable body could only collapse ahead of time. The so-called Dracatung wasn't just a language, it was also a great power. The normal human vocal cord was simply unable to produce the syllables of Dracatung. Even if one could somehow imitate the sound, they wouldn't be able to use the power contained within those syllables. There were strict conditions to using Dracatung, so much so that each of them was an obstacle on its own. Unless one fulfilled all of them, it would be impossible to use Dracatung. The first crucial condition was Dragon's Pressure. The spiritual weight of Dragon's Pressure created a type of harmonization with the world. If respiratory art was to change one's own rhythm to harmonize with one's surroundings, then Dragon's Pressure was to coerce the surroundings to harmonize with oneself. And the second crucial condition that must be fulfilled for those who sought the power of Dracatung was that their soul must be biased towards the dragon attribute. Furthermore, the user's spirit, or rather the quality of their soul, must at least reach the first stage of release. Otherwise, if you used Dracatung forcibly without having a qualified soul, you would either be oppressed by the power of Dracatung and become an irrational lunatic like the bizarre scales, or your soul would be completely drained. You would die and your true spirit would leave. Even Negary need to activate the dragon factor within soul's blood to form the dragon body before he could use Dracatung. As for his soul attribute, if he really wanted to point out a clear bias, it should belong to the manipulation attribute. The ability he obtained from his pseudo-release was germ manipulation, later became virus control, while Jack was implanted a part of the soul derived from him as his secondary soul obtained animosity manipulation. However, among the soul essence that Negary absorbed, there were those who had the dragon attribute. It was through manipulating this dragon attribute that Negary became qualified to use Dracatung. As for why Dracatung was so powerful, the reason came from how this world first originated. At first, the world originated from the Black Abyss. The white light cut through the Black Abyss and broke off a part of the Black Abyss. The light brought flames, and the flames burned this corner of the Black Abyss, which brought about most of what currently existed. And the nature of God that originally existed within that corner of the Black Abyss was changed by the flames. In total, there were 3 of such creatures, and one of them was the dragon. It could be said that the dragon was one of the ancestors of all life in this world. The dragons then continued to breed and multiply. During the era of the First Empire, dragons could be said to be commonplace. But unfortunately, as the level of the world constantly deteriorated, dragons gradually became unable to survive. During the age of the Third Empire, when the last dragon, Versace, passed away, true dragons no longer existed, only wyverns of impure blood. And at this point, even wyverns had become creatures that were difficult to run into and could be regarded as natural disasters in certain areas. The wyvern that Chris killed was one of the few remaining dragons left in this continent. As for the other two creatures from the Black Abyss, whose nature were changed during the first flame, one of them became the new deity. The new deity created the divine race, who hadn't fared that much better compared to the dragons. Only very few impure dragons still exist in this world, while the one that the Church of Divine Grace hails as God might be the last remaining member of the divine race, or it could also not be one. The final one was the giant. According to legend, the original giant had cut off his own flesh to create the creatures of this world. When his meat fell in the water, it became a fish. When it was thrown to the sky, it became a bird. And when it fell on the ground, it became various animals. A Nigerian Irabatus. In the end, when the giant didn't have much flesh left, he made the final creatures, the humans, in his own image. If there were no errors, the progenitor of all things in the Koshi mythos most likely referred to the giant. After all, the Koshi people were the fourth empire to exist, and most of what happened in the ancient times had already been gradually morphed and warped or simply lost to the ages. The Koshi people also wanted to cement their rule, so they hailed the giant as the progenitor of all things. And since the Koshi people were the giant spirit, that made them natural-born leaders. Naturally, there were various claims of how the giant ultimately ended up. In the Koshi mythos, the giant was the progenitor of all things and had died after deriving himself to form the creatures. After all, they claimed to be the spirit of the progenitor of all things, but if a progenitor actually showed up, it would be the Koshi who were the most unhappy. In another mythological biography, they claimed that the giant, who only had his skeleton left, traveled to an unknown land and became the one that governed the death of all things. There is also a claim that said the giant never left the first flame brought about by the white light and instead remained to guard it. In short, none of the original three gods had ever appeared again. This world eventually fell to become a low-magic world, while the flames would soon be extinguished. The world, created by the white light, was slowly coming to an end. But regardless, life continues. And for Nala, although she didn't like war, her fight must continue. At this point, this young girl was no longer what she used to be. Early on, she was simply the final straw that many chose to grasp at. Many others regarded her support as nothing but throwing her life away. Quite a few even laughed at her, regarding her as an oblivious country bumpkin. But now, slowly but surely, very few actually made such claims anymore, the reason being that she had actually brought the people hope. Just 3 days ago, the troops she led managed to arrive at Calamity in time to save it from Roya's siege. Using her instincts alone, when the Roya's army made a risky move, she flanked and ambushed them from the side, earning in-Turkam victory in what was thought to be a long-lost battle. The successive victories of Roya's had gotten a bit to their heads. In the end, it was Eldridge's policies that had continued to oppress the nobles in his country and raise them into ravenous wolves. In the early days of the war, it was also these ravenous wolf-like nobles who were the most enthusiastic. After all, so much had been taken from them by Eldridge's policies. To change their status quo, they had to either overthrow Eldridge's rule or obtain what they needed in the war. It was because of this that during the war, the nobles of Roya's were extraordinarily vicious, defeating the troops of in-Turkam battle after battle. The successive victories had made these Roya's aristocrats greedier and greedier. From their perspectives, in-Turkam was now just a lamb waiting to be slaughtered that couldn't mount anything resembling resistance. So 3 days ago, one of the aristocrats who participated in the siege chose to aggressively move out and take down the wall of Calamity. As a result, when they were attacking the city, Nala led the reinforcement onto the battlefield through a secluded route, took advantage of her extreme intuition to choose the perfect moment, and flanked this aggressive squad. It was because Nala had established her prestige within the reinforcement army that these soldiers were willing to take the initiative and followed her attack. And their trust wasn't for nothing, as Nala did indeed lead them to their first victory in a long time. Through this battle, the Saintress of Salvation Nala, who has been fighting at the forefront of the battlefield, won the worship of many people through the hope she brought, her bravery, and beautiful appearance. In the end, most people were visual creatures. Even Negary. It was because his men were still essentially human that he took a humanoid appearance in front of most people. Part of the reason was to invoke a sense of racial identity. Otherwise, there was no need for Negary to keep up a humanoid appearance at all in front of others. Even when they knew Negary wasn't human, as long as he kept up his appearance, he would still receive their respect and approval, thus making it more convenient for Negary to control them. If he instead took the appearance of a tentacle monster, even if Negary had the same fatal sense of charm and charisma as he does now, besides some people with special fetishes, most of those who submitted themselves to Negary would lack a sense of affinity. It was undeniable that appearance played a great role in many cases. If Nala was a woman with a bucket waist and the face of a sow, it would have been a lot tougher to convince Marshal Wells to give up command of Calamity rather than how smoothly it was going right now. After the first victory, quite a few people had apparently been given a sense of confidence, as some nobles of Intercam had also begun to support Calamity. Although they were unwilling to submit to the king, they also didn't want Intercam to be destroyed. With the emergence of Princess Nala and the hope of victory she brought, the various powers within the country finally began to reorganize and integrate themselves into the military. At this moment, within the fortress city of Calamity, the commanding officers of Intercam were gathered to discuss their plan of action. Although the right of command had been transferred to Nala due to Seth I's orders, Nala's understanding of war was lacking, to say the least, so she was more like a mascot during this meeting. The one who would truly decide the battle plan right now was still the previous commander, Marshal Alan Wells, and various knights with noble peerage. Among them, Rhys Laval, who had displayed his excellence in the previous battle, had also obtained a certain right to speak. "We are currently inferior to them in terms of both number and equipment," Alan Wells explained in a deep voice. "After taking that previous loss, that bastard Kata will surely be a lot more cautious, so I believe it is best that we continue to fortify our defenses for now." "Marshal, I think what Sir Wells suggested makes sense. Since more and more support is arriving from forces within the country, keeping up our defenses would be best to ensure victory," one of the knights agreed. During this period, the army structure was very complicated. The royal family had its own army, but it wasn't too much bigger than an aristocrat's personal army. An army consisted mostly of troops supplied by nobles in accordance with their duties, knights who volunteer their service, and large numbers of hired mercenaries. While the army marshal technically had full control over it, they were still subjected to the restrictions and opinions of noble knights. The way it currently was, vassals were afforded a lot of autonomy as long as they fulfilled their obligations, which was also one of the main reasons why the aristocrats would rather let this country perish rather than sending more troops to aid the war effort. "I don't think it's appropriate," Rhys spoke up on the other side. "Roya's army is stronger than we are. This is a fact, and also the exact reason why we can't keep blindly defending as we have done. Otherwise, we might not be able to keep it up. If Roya's was only a bit stronger than Intercam, then defense was indeed the correct approach. But in truth, even if they kept up their defenses the same way they had been doing, Roya's army would still be able to lay siege and take down Calamity in very little time. The difference in strength was simply too great. And so, if we really want to seize a chance at victory, we have to think of a way to actively initiate an attack and teach Roya's army a lesson. We need to strike at their morale to put pressure on them, forcing them to halt their offensive momentum and buy more time to wait for support," Rhys said. "Are you kidding me?" the knight scoffed. "Choosing to take the offensive instead of defending while being at a disadvantage is nothing but suicide. You think it's impossible, the Roya's army also think it's impossible, and that's exactly why there's a chance for us to succeed in the first place," Rhys said with a sigh. This tactic carried great risk, and if they failed, it would mean total annihilation. If possible, he would rather not take this risk, but the current situation was one where blindly defending meant they had no chance at winning. Then tonight, a squad of elites will move out from the fortress and perform a night raid. Nala, who had been listening blankly up to now, suddenly declared and caused everyone in the room to be stunned. "Sir Marshal, are you serious?" Alan Wells stood up in shock and asked. "Yeah, let's decide on that," I'll lead the raid team tonight. Is anyone here willing to participate? Nala nodded affirmatively. Her instincts told her that this operation would very likely succeed, and if that was true, then why not? Alfie, it's too risky, Marshal. Another knight on the side loudly refuted. But Turkham has already reached the point where we have to take such risks. Nala looked up at the knight and softly replied. But there's no need for the Marshal to take the risk. I can also lead the team. The knight lost in Nala's resolute gaze, lowered his head and spoke. I have nothing to fear. Nala's eyes were bright and clear. Then her tone suddenly turned solemn. Knight, please tell me your name. Alkers, the knight stood upright with his hand on his sword, as if he was receiving some sort of glory. Alkers Lewis, heir of the School of Steel. Then, are you willing to come with me tonight? With a smile on her face, Nala asked softly, exuding the proof of the draconic hero, a unique sense of charisma that could solicit the adoration of all. Alkers clenched the hilt of his sword tightly, lowered his head, and answered with a softened tone, As you wish. As Reese watched from the side, he was also feeling moved. This was the heir of the draconic hero. In history, anyone who awakened the dragon's blood had, without exception, qualities beyond ordinary people. Whether they became devils or heroes, they had an extremely persuasive sense of charisma that caused people to willingly follow them. Without a doubt, they were natural-born leaders. And today, Nala was displaying this very quality. As Reese looked around, the people here were feeling more or less mixed emotions of admiration and adoration towards this saintress of salvation. And he was the same. He who had lived and was molded by darkness naturally did not trust others. But if it was Nala, he would pledge his loyalty and trust her without hesitation. As night fell, an elite team, led by Nala, took advantage of the night's cover and approached the Roya's barracks to initiate a raid. Just as Reese had predicted, the long-term victory made the aristocrats of Roya's arrogant. Even though Marshal Kata of Roya's had faced defeat just before, they were still holding an impression of Turkham as being a lamb waiting to be butchered. Despite having people on night patrol, the Roya's soldiers who had been holding the initiative weren't very serious about it. In fact, it could even be said that they were slacking, so the elite team successfully infiltrated the Roya's barracks. Our goal is to assassinate their commanders, cause internal strife within Roya's army, and buy more time for our support to arrive. Reese re-emphasized before they went in, we only have half an hour. Once that time is up, then regardless of whether or not we succeed, we must retreat immediately. As he looked at the others splitting up, Reese reached for the small cloth bag that he carried with him. Inside, it was the book of monsters that he had picked up in the graveyard of that village. The opportunity that he mentioned in the meeting earlier today was never the act of killing the enemy commanders. Doing that might cause a certain degree of chaos in the Roya's army, but it wouldn't solve the real crisis. They wouldn't be able to kill every commander that Roya's had. And after a short period of chaos, this assassination would even cause the Roya's army to accelerate its offensive in retaliation instead. So if you really wanted to stall the Roya's soldiers, you could only rely on other methods, such as a plague. Reese's eyes were cold as he walked directly towards his destination. He had asked around earlier and found out that the daily supply of water used by the Roya's soldiers came from a small lake, where he attacked and killed a sentry when he arrived. Looking down at the sentry's corpse, Reese took out the book. Although a bit of hesitation flashed by in his eyes, he still turned to one of the pages. An underwater monster was depicted here. This monster was weak enough that a child would be able to kill it with a knife as long as they could overcome their fear. But if it was allowed to play its role, it would be the most terrifying demon known to man. Sounds of disturbance could be heard coming from the barracks. The others had obviously started to take action, and there was no longer time to hesitate. Reese pulled out a dagger, plunged it into the sentry's body, then dripped his blood onto the page of the book. The maggot-like patterns on the page of the book began to come to life as transparent tentacles began to stretch outwards from the parchment. Reese quickly turned the page toward the body on the ground. The transparent tentacles reached into the corpse's wound, then slowly slithered into the wound until it was completely inside the body. Reese tied a rock to the corpse's foot, then threw it into the water. As he watched the body slowly sinking into the water, Reese was hyperventilating. If the description in the book wasn't wrong, then his actions just now were downright evil. There was no distinction of good and evil in war, but there were distinctions in the means used for war, such as massacres or driving peasants from their homes. The use of chemical weapons or poison, etc., were generally frowned upon as being unjust, and his current actions would not only bring disaster to the Roya soldiers, but it would also spell disaster for generations to come. This lake itself would become a forbidden zone or restricted area. The monster he just created was called the Floating Corpse Maggot. This monster could easily be killed in direct combat. However, its true power lies in its ability to proliferate in the water. When it came into contact with a body of water, it would produce a large number of larvae that could survive and fully assimilate themselves into it. They were odorless, colorless, and shapeless, just like ordinary lake water. However, once a person came into contact with this contaminated lake water, the floating corpse maggot inside would become parasites within their bodies. A host of these parasites would feel their limbs weakening, a sense of dizziness as well as headaches. Furthermore, they would become hungry very easily. If they couldn't sate this hunger in time, they would drop dead at any moment. Even if they didn't suddenly drop dead, their bodies and physique would gradually change to look like corpses soaked in water. Even more frightening was that these maggots could almost perfectly harmonize their rhythm with water, making it so that even expert practitioners of respiratory art would be unable to discover them. Beta, unless someone knew about their existence and specifically targeted them, these maggots simply could not be discovered. Only through long-term observation would someone even notice that there was a problem with the water. This place will probably be known as the Cursed Lake in the future. Reese felt a chill as he looked at the calm surface of the lake. This small body of water would likely take the lives of countless people, and he would be the one responsible for it. Looking down at the book of monsters that had another blank page and 7 other pages left, Reese carefully wrapped it up and swiftly returned to Calamity. On the other side, Nala was also facing a tough battle. Her opponent was a middle-aged officer of Royas. She was feeling a sense of discomfort as there was a sort of power flowing within her opponent's body. This power was related to her dragon's blood, yet they were mutually exclusive at the same time. The middle-aged officer was wielding a cutlass that also gave off an ominous presence that caused Nala to frown involuntarily. Intercam's sane tress of salvation, Smick said with a sigh. It should be 7 years since we last met, although I knew this day would eventually come. Who are you? Nala held her knight's sword as she observed the officer. His words suggested that he had met her 7 years ago. Smick Lancher. Let's just say I was Chris' comrade in arms. After all, we fought alongside one another 7 years ago. A sense of nostalgia flashed by Smick's eyes. Even after 7 years, he still couldn't forget that battle. Although I say that, our standpoints are simply different. Since you are the one person who could actually overturn Roya's war situation, I'm afraid I'll have you remain here. Smick drew his cutlass and slowly disappeared. Is that so? Nala vaguely remembered Rivers telling her about how they had fought alongside a Roya soldier named Smick 7 years ago. If there were no mistakes, then this should be him. But as he had said, since they had different standpoints, there was nothing more to say. Nala slowed her breathing down. The other person's breathing had proven to her that he was also a practitioner of respiratory art, so his abrupt disappearance should be an effect of a certain school of respiratory art. Right before it arrived, Nala sensed the other party's attack, so she raised her knight's sword to block it. She quickly noticed something was wrong and immediately retreated. As she raised her sword again, she found that the weapon in her hand had already been cut in half. That cutlass! Nala's heart sank. She didn't expect that strange weapon to be so sharp. Her knight's sword was something granted by the king. Although it wasn't exactly a precious treasure, it was still a fine article of craftsmanship. Normal knights' families would even be able to use it as an heirloom. And yet it was cleanly cut in half with a single slash. That really was a bit too much. Although I will not kill you because of the ancient covenant, please give up resistance. Smick's voice was floating indistinctly in the air, making it so that no one knew where he would appear next to end your life. I will hold you captive until the end of the war. Dream on. Nala narrowed her eyes and finally began to take him seriously. A faint pressure began to awaken on her body as her originally blue pupils turned into golden vertical pupils. Her fair throat also moved ever so slightly, as if some sort of internal structure was changing. Smick was surprised to find that, at that very moment, the rhythm of the surrounding environment had changed by itself to match and harmonize with Nala. Together with Nala's respiratory art, Smick even had the illusion that there was nowhere he could hide. Daughter of Dragons. Smick thought of Nala's other title. Without hesitation, he directly moved in for the kill. His figure instantly vanished and appeared directly in front of Nala as his cutlass slashed directly at her. Nala's vertical pupil didn't even blink, as if she had turned a blind eye to the incoming cutlass. The air seemed to condense right at this moment to block Smick's cutlass, and even Smick's harmonization with the surrounding rhythm was forcefully cut off. Nala swung the broken sword in her hand and left a clear mark on Smick's chest, as if there was an invisible blade at the end of the broken sword. Nala's eyes slowly changed back to normal as the sound of armor clamoring could be heard outside. Obviously, Roya's army had started to respond to their raid. She didn't try to confirm Smick's status and instead instinctively retreated. Soon after Nala left, quite a few soldiers had surrounded this place. Smick slowly stood up. The wound on his chest had already formed a scab. After being infected by the soul's blood, his physique was no longer that of a human, so such wounds would heal in an instant. As he glanced towards where Nala had escaped, his eyes became sullen. He raised his hand, looked down at his powerful palm, and felt a deep sense of fear. Ultimately, he still chose to hold back. Smick then covered his face and groaned wildly. The elite team would soon return to Calamity. Their raid tonight could be considered to be relatively fruitful. They destroyed a granary, killed 5 commanding officers, some soldiers, and managed to cause a certain amount of chaos in the enemy ranks. Although at the same time, they also lost 3 to 4 people, all of whom were elites. Of course, if you counted the floating corpse insect that Reese released as well, then this operation could be considered to be extremely successful. But for Turkam, who has been passively taking a beating all this time, this was also another rare victory. In order to improve morale, they even held a small celebration for the soldiers. However, during the party, Nala, who was the focus of them all, seemed a bit distracted. My sword is a problem. If I encounter him next time, I would be at a weaponry disadvantage again. Nala looked down at the broken sword in her hand and thought about the battle with Smick. She could feel that he was still somewhat holding back. Otherwise, it would have been her who was wounded and not him. "Are you worried about your weapon, Marshal?" asked a knight next to her. "You are." Nala really had no impression of this person. "I really am lacking a good knight's sword." Elbaz the knight answered. "My territory is quite close to Calamity. We found a treasured sword there recently. I'm sure it would satisfy you, Marshal." To be honest, I originally wanted to keep the sword as an heirloom, but now it seems like it would be best to give it to your excellency, or perhaps the sword had been waiting for your excellency in the first place. "What do you mean?" Nala was a bit puzzled. "I've already sent someone to pick it up. The sword should be ready to be presented to your excellency in a short while." Elbaz replied with a smile. In the evening, when the sword was delivered, Nala finally understood what the man had meant. As soon as she saw the sword, Nala felt that she had a wondrous connection with the sword. Alpha body. It was said that the blood of a dragon was added to the sword when it was being forged. With each swing, you could hear the roar of the dragon. "Unfortunately, I simply can't use this sword," Elbaz explained with a sigh. "With every swing, I feel my heart being oppressed by an unknown force. And if someone tried to use it forcibly, they might even cough up blood and collapse on the spot. I think it must be that we were not qualified to wield it. But since the Marshal's dragon bloodline has been awakened, your excellency must be the fated master of this sword." Reese felt something amiss as he listened from the side. After all, right after Nala's sword had just been broken, someone immediately offered her a sword that fitted her perfectly. This was too much of coincidence. But he'd already asked the people in the camp, Elbaz was indeed a noble with a nearby territory, and someone had tested that sword prior to bringing it to Nala, confirming that there was no such thing as poison or a curse on it. Moreover, even with Nala's superhuman intuition, she didn't perceive any malice, so she reached out and received the Night Sword. The sword's guard was a pair of dragon wings, and if you look from aside, you would even notice that there were patterns of dragon scales on the blade of the sword. As Nala held the sword in her hand, she felt a connection forming between the weapon and her bloodline. The sword almost felt like an extension of her arm. At the same time, it greatly promoted the awakening of her dragon's blood. With this sword, her strength had risen by at least 30%. As Nala brandished the sword, the weapon gave off a faint rumble almost like the roar of a dragon. The knights that gathered around also rained her in praise and admiration. This kind of display could also improve the morale of the troops, and if this story were to be passed down, it could even become a part of myths and legends. Standing amongst the crowd, Elbaz had a satisfied smile on his face. The task that Lord Negary assigned him had been completed, and he had confirmed that Nala's intuition would not react to pure goodwill, but sometimes goodwill wasn't necessarily a good thing. For the next few days, Roya's offense was indeed slowed down. The floating corpse insects had already begun to spread among Roya soldiers. Although floating corpse insects died very easily, there were many places where water was necessary within the barracks, so their speed of propagation wasn't slow. There weren't a lot of ways to deal with a pandemic in this era. When the water problem was noticed, quite a few soldiers and even officers had already been infected, causing the war situation to tilt, so that at least for now, the war was no longer one-sided. And with the arrival of support from various forces, the threat of Royas had basically been resolved in Calamity, causing many in Turkam to call a divine grace. When the horns of counterattack were blown in Turkam, several battles were still being ongoing in the underside that no one could see. Eldridge, how much longer can you sit still for? Negary sat on the throne and peered into the distance while his figure slowly faded into the darkness. The infiltration into the Church of Divine Grace must also be accelerated. With Negary's involvement, the war gradually leaned towards Turkam, and a vigorous counterattack began. Under Nala's lead, the lost territories were reclaimed little by little, causing Turkam, who nearly had their spine broken, to burst with renewed enthusiasm and vigor. The nearly ruined country of Turkam was once again rejuvenated, and Nala's name of Saintress of Salvation was becoming more and more legitimate day by day. The war was also becoming crueler day by day. Among the land that they reclaimed, quite a few of the nobles who used to own them were already dead. If you make enough military contributions in battle, then those who were originally peasants could become knights, while those who were originally knights could obtain peerage in their own territory. Meanwhile, Roya's side was even more dedicated to the war, because they had no other choice. Under the pressure Eldridge had placed, these nobles barely had any rights and authority remaining. If they couldn't win this war, then the only choice left for them was to launch a rebellion on Eldridge. The counterattack began and continued for 3 years, the devastation and intensity of which was significantly greater compared to the 7 years before that. This was a long staircase with stone lampstands lining on both sides that housed orange flames within them. At the end of the staircase, there was a huge black stone statue that depicted a humanoid creature. The creature had both arms extended upwards as if begging for something, or perhaps embracing something. The stone statue was facing away from the staircase, while a person was staring at the back of this stone statue as if pondering something. Even when there were noises coming from the stairs behind him, the man didn't pay any attention to it and simply continued to stare at the stone statue. His face was a little blurred, but if someone focused on him, they would feel that he gave off a natural sense of pressure, followed by a feeling that he was born to be above them, as if the only thing that they should do was prostrate themselves at his feet. If the people of Hale saw this man, they would find his existence to be similar to the god within their perception. He was like an abyss that no matter how much one tried, they would never be able to tell his true depths. Your Majesty, Clee County. 2 men in uniform appeared from the bottom of the stairs. Both of them had heavy expressions on their faces. Quite obviously, the situation of Royas today had made them concerned. Already no, Eldridge interrupted the two. It was simply the loss of Clee County that was reclaimed by Intercam. Even though Clee County was one of the few territories originally belonging to Intercam that they still had left, this stone statue in front of him was called the Statue of the Last God. It was the root of Royas, the ancestral spirit ritual of Royas, and the potion of the last god he developed. Both came from this stone statue. What a hopeless world we live in, Eldridge said with a sigh. After several generations of accumulation, it was he who managed to obtain more information from the statue of the last god. It was information from the statue of the last god that shaped Royas into what it was today, but it was also what was causing Eldridge to slowly step towards his destruction. For example, the truth about the collapse of the First Empire. The First Empire was called the Age of the Gods. At that time, among the three gods born from the first flame, except for the giant that created all things from his body, the new deity and the progenitor dragon still remained in this world. Both the divine race and the dragon race were not considered rare. Unfortunately, the majority of the divine race and dragon race then abandoned this world. It could be said that, from the perspective of this world, the new deity and the progenitor dragon were both sinners. It was their abandonment that led to the first eruption of the Black Abyss and caused the First Empire to perish. If the last god, which was this statue in front of him, had not appeared together with a few other heroes who stood up to save this world, then the world itself might have already returned to the Black Abyss. The price to pay for salvation was that the last god turned into the statue that he was today. Furthermore, now that the Black Abyss had become turbulent again, who are they going to rely on if there was only one last god? That fake god from the Church of Divine Grace? Or the ghouls in Sacred Valley? Perhaps Negary, who has caused me countless troubles, might be qualified to do such a thing. But that entity would definitely not do that. Even if this entire world fell to ruin, he would not do such a thing. Who's their leader? Eldridge asked. Nala, Tagula. His two subordinates replied in a deep voice. I understand. You may step down. Eldridge nodded and continued to stare at the stone statue. Eldridge's attitude was causing his two subordinates to feel more and more puzzled day by day. With His Majesty's greatness, in the past, he would have already arranged layers upon layers of preparations so that even the so-called Saintress of Salvation wouldn't even get a chance to resist. It was till the Nigerian era. But in truth, ever since the appearance of that Saintress of Salvation, Eldridge had not left this place, nor did he send down any orders. For the last 3 years, it had been them who dealt with every official business, big or small. Saintress of Salvation. Haha, Eldridge simply grinned. She's indeed salvation, just not for a mere country. He stared at the statue of the last god and fell back into contemplation. Your Excellency the Princess, please hand over the command to Sir Reese Laval and come with me back to the capital to receive further orders, the herald coldly said, and caused a disturbance in the barracks. This is a decision made by both His Majesty and the Grand Dukes, the herald continued. Nala was currently donning her armor with the dragon scale sword in her hand. Compared to 3 years ago, she had matured considerably. She glanced around herself. The nobles and knights who followed her were displaying anger and confused expressions on their faces, but some of them had also lowered their heads in shame. Reese was not blinded by the right to command. He understood very well what was happening right now. It was nothing more than the country's own power struggle. At this point, Intercam had already reclaimed the majority of their lost territories, leaving at most 1 or 2 battles left. As the Saintress of Salvation who had saved Intercam, Nala's prestige had reached a terrifying degree, enough to cause a few people to lose sleep. Seth I was certainly one of them, but they also included the very aristocrats who supported her to this position in the first place. Wasn't it Eldridge's prestige that allowed him to completely oppress every single force, including aristocrats within his country? Well, the current Nala had a level of prestige that surpassed Eldridge's prestige in Royas at the beginning of the war. If she really took the throne, the power of aristocrats in Intercam would likely fall to a historical low. If these people were able to sit still while Intercam fell to ruin for the sake of their aristocratic rights, It was natural that they wouldn't sit still and watch as Nala continued to develop her forces and prestige. Naturally, Nala's character could be vouched for by all of her subordinates and the people she had met, but there was still the Church of Divine Grace who placed her onto this position in the first place. Not to mention her devout believer of a mother. These were all factors that could affect her. Therefore, victories under Nala's name could not be allowed to increase. Meaning, recalling her to the capital to act as a mascot was the right choice to make. This way, Nala would only be the leader in the early stages of the counterattack, while it would be Rhys who truly completed the counterattack. Even if Rhys didn't want to admit it, he was still a member of the nobility. He could support Nala's ascension to the throne, but he could not allow Nala become the puppet of the church. And this was also part of the nobles' consideration. Although Nala was simple, she was not stupid. This command was jointly issued by the majority of those in power within the country. She couldn't resist it, nor did she plan to do so. Be careful of Seth the First. The other domestic nobles might still hope for you to take the throne, but Seth would surely try to do something about it. As Rhys took over command and became the new marshal, he whispered that to Nala. The only thing he could do right now was to take good control of military power for Nala's sake.